The foreman slammed the ledger down on Evelyn Harper's desk so hard the inkwell rattled. "You've been going through records that don't concern you," Gerald Moss said, his voice low and deliberate, the kind of quiet that was worse than shouting. "I hired you to balance payroll, not to dig through property files that are none of your business." Evelyn didn't flinch. She'd learned not to flinch. "The payroll and the property files happen to share the same discrepancies, Mr. Moss. $40 missing from Henderson's wages last month. Same amount, different name, routed to a company I can't find registered anywhere in Montana territory." Moss leaned across the desk until she could smell the tobacco on him. "Find it somewhere else, or find yourself a different job." He left without closing the door. A warning dressed up as a conversation. Evelyn sat very still for a moment, then picked up her pen and went back to work. If this kind of story speaks to you, a woman who refuses to be intimidated, a conspiracy buried in mountains of paperwork, and a quiet cowboy hiding a secret larger than the West itself, then you are exactly where you need to be. Subscribe to this channel and follow every chapter of this story to the end, because what comes next will leave you breathless. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me the city and country where you're watching. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Now, let's begin. The stagecoach dropped her at the edge of nowhere, which was exactly what she'd expected. Evelyn Harper stepped down onto a road that was barely a road. Two-wheel ruts pressed into cold Montana earth, lined on both sides by pine trees so tall they made the sky look small. Her suitcase was not large. She hadn't needed to pack much because she hadn't had much to pack. That was what happened when a family lost everything. You stopped accumulating things and started learning to travel light. She was 26 years old and she felt 50. The driver handed down her case without ceremony. "Blackstone Summit's another 2 miles up that trail," he said, nodding toward a path that disappeared into the trees. "They'll send someone down when they're expecting you." "You expected?" "Supposedly," Evelyn said. He didn't sound convinced. Neither was she, entirely. The letter of employment had arrived 6 weeks ago, forwarded through 3 different post offices before it finally caught up with her in Billings. It was brief and businesslike. Blackstone Summit Ranch requires an experienced bookkeeper beginning first week of October. Room and board provided. Salary commensurate with qualifications. Contact Gerald Moss, ranch foreman, if interested. She'd been interested. She hadn't had a great deal of choice. The stagecoach rolled on. Evelyn picked up her suitcase and started walking. The trail was steep and uneven, the kind of terrain that assumed everyone using it was on horseback. Twice she had to stop and shift her grip on the case, her fingers aching in the October cold. The pines pressed close on either side, blocking the wind but also the light, and somewhere above her a raven called once and fell silent. She kept walking. She had learned that the only thing to do with a difficult road was to keep moving along it, because stopping didn't make it shorter. She smelled the ranch before she saw it. Wood smoke and horses and the particular mineral sharpness of mountain air. Then the trees opened up and there it was. A cluster of low, dark buildings arranged around a central yard. A barn twice the size of the main house, a bunkhouse to the east with smoke rising from his chimney, and beyond all of it, the mountains. They were enormous in the way that Montana mountains always were, close enough to seem like walls and yet somehow still distant, their upper reaches already edged with snow. The valley that cradled the ranch was wide and grass-heavy and beautiful in a severe, practical way, the kind of beauty that didn't ask to be admired and didn't particularly care whether it was. Evelyn stood at the edge of the yard and took it all in. A man came out of the barn. He was tall and broad-shouldered, somewhere in his mid-40s, with a foreman's walk, the kind of deliberate, unhurried stride that said he owned the ground under his boots whether he did or not. He wore his hat pulled low and his expression lower. "Harper?" he said. "Yes, you're late." She had checked the letter twice that morning. "My understanding was that I was expected today, Mr. Moss. The stage schedule isn't something I control." He looked at her the way men sometimes looked at women who spoke in complete sentences, like it was a minor inconvenience he hadn't anticipated. "Follow me," he said, and turned without waiting. She followed him. He showed her the office, a small room off the main house with a desk and 2 chairs and shelves of ledgers so old the spines were cracking. The ledgers were not organized in any system she could immediately identify. They appeared to have been organized by the principle of putting things wherever there was space, which was not a principle so much as an absence of one. "Previous bookkeeper left in August," Moss said. "Month's worth of payroll is behind. You'll start there." "What happened to the previous bookkeeper?" Evelyn asked. Moss paused, just briefly, just long enough for her to notice. Family situation, he said. Needed to leave suddenly. You'll have everything you need here. He gestured at the shelves with a kind of dismissive confidence, as though the mess were someone else's problem, which she supposed it now was. I'll need access to all the records, she said. Not just payroll. If I'm to properly maintain the accounts, I need to understand the full picture. Land holdings, contracts, supplier agreements. You need payroll. Start there. He left. Evelyn looked at the shelves. Then she sat down, opened the first ledger she could reach, and started reading. She worked through dinner. One of the ranch hands, a young man named Curtis with a sunburned neck and nervous hands, brought her a plate of something that involved beans and salt pork and set it on the edge of the desk without a word. She thanked him. He retreated. She ate without stopping her reading. The payroll ledger for the past year was a mess in the truest sense. Entries crossed out and rewritten, columns that didn't add up on the first pass. Occasional pages where the handwriting changed entirely, suggesting that whoever had been keeping the books had not always been the same person. That alone wasn't necessarily suspicious. Ranch bookkeepers turned over. People got sick. But there were patterns in the mess, and Evelyn had spent enough time in financial records, her father's records before they lost the ranch, and the attorney's records afterward when they were trying to understand exactly how they'd lost it, to know that certain patterns meant something. 3 ranch hands' wages, for instance, were shorted by similar amounts across multiple months. Not drastically, not the kind of shortage that screamed fraud immediately. $15 here, $12 there, small enough to attribute to error, but consistent. And the amounts, when she added them up across 6 months for those 3 names, came to exactly $432. She wrote that figure down. Then she went back 6 more months and checked the ledger before it. Same pattern. Different names, but the same structure. Small, consistent shortages, the kind a busy foreman might dismiss as rounding errors. She wrote down the total from the earlier period. When she added the 2 together, she sat with the number for a long moment. $864. Vanished from ranch hands' wages over 12 months, so quietly and carefully that it was invisible unless you were specifically looking for it. She was specifically looking. She put the ledger aside and reached for the next one on the stack. The main house was quiet by 10 o'clock. Evelyn could hear the bunkhouse across the yard, low voices, someone playing a harmonica badly, the stamp of boots. But the house itself had settled into the particular silence of a place where the person who lived in it spent very little time sitting still. She'd noticed that about the main house even during the brief walk-through Moss had given her. It was well-maintained but impersonal, the furniture practical and undecorated, no photographs or paintings on the walls, no accumulated clutter of a lived life. Either no one spent much time here, or the person who did had no interest in comfort. She heard boots on the porch at around 10:30. They were different from Moss's boots. Lighter step, not the heavy, authority-announcing stride of the foreman. She didn't look up from the ledger immediately, assuming it was one of the hands come to ask something. But the footsteps paused at the office doorway and didn't advance, and after a moment she did look up. The man standing in the doorway was not Moss. He was younger. Early 30s, she estimated, with the build of someone who worked outdoors rather than supervised people who worked outdoors. He was still in his coat and hat, which suggested he'd been outside late, and his boots were muddy in a way that said actual work, not just walking across a yard. He had a quiet face, the kind that didn't announce itself. "Sorry," he said. "Didn't mean to interrupt. Curtis mentioned the new bookkeeper was still at it. I wanted to see if you needed anything." "I'm fine," she said. Then, because she was too tired for social performance, "Who are you?" "Nolan," he said. "I work the ranch." She waited for a last name. He didn't offer one. "Nolan," she repeated. "Do all the hands check on the new bookkeeper at 10:30 at night?" Something moved in his expression. Not quite amusement, but in the neighborhood of it. "Usually not," he said. "You looked like you might be here until sunrise." "I might be," Evelyn said honestly. "These records are a disaster." He looked at the shelves. He didn't say anything, which she noticed. Most people, confronted with a statement like that, would either agree or defend the situation. He just looked at the ledgers the way she imagined a carpenter might look at a wall someone had built wrong, assessing, not reacting. "How bad?" he said. "Bad enough." She paused, then decided she had nothing to lose by saying it. "Whoever managed these accounts before me was either deeply incompetent or deliberately obscuring things. I haven't determined which yet." Nolan looked at her then. It was a direct look, the kind that meant he was actually paying attention rather than performing attention. "You'll figure it out," he said. and there was something in the way he said it. Not flattery, not encouragement exactly, just a simple statement of expectation that she found unexpectedly steadying. "Good night, Nolan," she said. "Good night, Miss Harper," he said, and walked back down the porch. She sat for a moment after he'd gone, aware that she'd told a virtual stranger more about her suspicions regarding the ranch accounts in 2 minutes than she'd intended to tell anyone. Then she picked up the ledger and kept reading. She found the property file 3 days later. It wasn't where it should have been. It wasn't in the office at all, in fact, which was perhaps why it had survived whatever cleaning out or reorganization might have preceded her arrival. She found it behind a loose board in the bottom shelf, wrapped in oilcloth, the kind of hiding that wasn't sophisticated so much as practical. Whoever had put it there had wanted it out of the way but not destroyed. The file contained survey records going back 15 years. Land descriptions, boundary markers, acreage tallies. She spread them on the desk and compared them to the ledger entries she'd already mapped, and within an hour she understood something she hadn't understood before. The wage theft was not the primary scheme. It was too small for that. A few $100s a year from ranch hand wages didn't explain the elaborate structure she was beginning to see. The wage theft was almost incidental, a secondary operation running alongside something larger. The property transfers were the thing. Between the survey records and the ledger entries, she could see a pattern of small but significant boundary adjustments. Parcels of Blackstone Summit's land that appeared in one year's records as part of the ranch's holdings and in subsequent years appeared transferred to other names. Shell companies, most of them, with names like Consolidated Western Properties and Summit Ridge Holdings that sounded substantial, but left no trace in any territorial directory she'd encountered. The transfers were recorded technically. That was what made it difficult. They weren't simply theft. They were disguised as legitimate sales, documented in ledgers she'd assumed were complete, but which she was now realizing had pages missing. Carefully missing. Not torn out. Cut clean with a thin blade close to the spine so that if you weren't counting pages, you might not notice. She sat back and looked at the ceiling. Her hands were steady. That was something she'd learned after the business with her family's ranch, to keep her hands steady even when her chest was doing something complicated. She thought about what she was looking at. She thought about the previous bookkeeper who'd left suddenly in August due to a family situation. She thought about Moss's face when she'd asked about it. That brief pause, that fraction of a second before the explanation came. She closed the file and put it back in the oilcloth. Then she thought better of it, took it back out, and put it in the bottom of her own suitcase under her extra skirt. Moss found her at the payroll ledger the next morning and stood over her desk for a long moment before speaking. She felt him there before she saw him. The particular quality of his silence was different from other silences, heavier somehow, the silence of a man conducting surveillance while pretending to be simply present. "Getting on all right?" he said. "Fine," she said. "I should have the payroll caught up by end of week." "Good." He didn't leave. "You haven't found anything confusing? In the records?" She looked up. He was watching her with an expression she recognized. It was the expression of a man who is asking one question while meaning a different one. "The records are somewhat disorganized," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "I'm working through it systematically." "Right." He tapped 2 fingers on the edge of her desk, a habit she'd already noticed. "If you come across anything that seems confusing, anything that seems like it might be above the bookkeeping level, you bring it to me first, not to anyone else. That's how we handle things here." "Of course," she said. He held her gaze for a moment that lasted 1 beat too long. Then he left. She waited until she could no longer hear his boots, then wrote down everything she remembered about the property file from memory in a notation system her father had taught her that would look like inventory tallies to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. Esque. She started waking up at 4 in the morning. It wasn't entirely deliberate. She'd always slept lightly, and the ranch sounds were different from town sounds, different in their rhythms and their meanings, and her body hadn't adjusted yet. But she found that those early hours before the hands were up and before Moss made his first morning rounds were the most productive hours she had. She moved through the office quickly and quietly, working through the lower shelves she hadn't reached yet, cross-referencing dates and totals and names. On the 4th morning of this, she heard the barn door. Not the creak and bang of someone opening it carelessly, but the soft, deliberate sound of someone who knew exactly how to move the door without waking the horses. She went to the office window and looked out. Nolan. He was already in the yard, heading toward the far pasture fence with a coil of wire over one shoulder and a pair of fence pliers at his belt. The sky was barely gray. He moved like someone who had been awake long before 4. She watched him for a moment, this man who fixed fences before dawn and brought plates of food to new bookkeepers and offered simple statements of confidence without asking for anything in return. There was something that didn't quite fit about him, and she'd learned, the hard way, the most expensive possible way, to pay attention to things that didn't quite fit. But there were things that didn't fit in a dishonest direction and things that didn't fit in some other direction entirely, and she hadn't determined yet which category Nolan fell into. She went back to the ledgers. The first direct confrontation happened on a Wednesday, 2.5 weeks after her arrival. She had been matching property descriptions from the survey records against territorial registration files that one of the Billings attorneys she'd worked with during her family's case had helped her obtain by post. It had taken most of her first week's wages to pay for the telegraph correspondence, and she hadn't told anyone she'd sent it. And when the documents arrived in the weekly mail bundle, she'd slipped them into her coat before Moss's daily inspection of incoming correspondence, which she'd noticed he did without acknowledging that he did it. The registration files confirmed what she'd suspected. The companies receiving the transferred land parcels, Consolidated Western Properties, Summit Ridge Holdings, and 2 others she'd identified. All traced back through a chain of registered agents and notarized paperwork to a single individual. A man named Calder Drummond, who operated out of Helena and whose name appeared in none of the on-ranch documents, but whose signature she now recognized on the transferring agent paperwork for every single suspicious land transfer she'd cataloged. Drummond. She'd seen that name before. She pulled out the notes she'd taken about her own family's case. Not in the files she kept in the office, but the ones in her head where she kept the things that mattered most. And there it was. Not Drummond himself, but a company name she'd seen referenced in the margins of documents she'd examined after they'd lost the Harper Ranch. Consolidated Western Properties. Same name, same structure. Her hands were not quite steady. She was still sitting with that when Moss appeared in the doorway. "What are you working on?" he said. I didn't say it casually. There was an edge in it. She looked up. She'd had just enough time to slide the registration files under the ledger, which was either quick thinking or instinct, she wasn't sure which. "Cross-referencing the supplier accounts," she said. "There are some discrepancies I want to resolve before I close the month." He came into the office, which he didn't usually do. He came to the side of the desk and looked at what was visible. The ledger, the payroll sheets, a column of figures she'd been working on. Nothing incriminating. She'd made sure of that. He looked at her. "You ask a lot of questions for a bookkeeper," he said. "I ask exactly as many questions as an accurate set of accounts requires," she said. "Harper." He said her name like it was a door he was closing. "I brought you here to do a specific job. You do that job. You don't go looking for complications." "I'm not looking for complications," she said. "I'm looking at what's in front of me." He stared at her for 5 full seconds. She counted them. Then he said, "The ranch owner will be visiting in 2 weeks. Everything needs to be in order before then. Focus on that." He left. She waited, then pulled the registration files back out, folded them, and tucked them into the lining of her coat. The ranch owner. She hadn't been told there was an owner separate from Moss, though she'd assumed there must be. Foreman managed, they didn't own. She'd had no way to contact the owner directly because no one had mentioned an owner. Moss had handled the hiring correspondence entirely. She thought about that for a while. Then she thought about the owner's upcoming visit and what it might mean, and whether it was an opportunity or another layer of the problem she was trying to understand.
Hi.
It was Nolan who answered her question, though not in any way she'd anticipated. She found him that evening at the horse corral, watching a young gelding she'd seen being worked that afternoon. He leaned on the fence with the easy comfort of someone who spent more time outdoors than in, and he didn't seem surprised when she came to stand beside him, which she took to mean he'd heard her coming. "The owner," she said without preamble, because she'd decided there was no strategic advantage to preamble at this point. "Who is it?" Nolan was quiet for a moment. The gelding moved along the far fence, interested in something in the grass. "What makes you ask?" "Moss mentioned they're coming in 2 weeks. I realized I don't know anything about the ownership structure of this ranch, and I should. For the accounts." He looked at the horse rather than her. "The family's had this land for 30 years, he said. Built it up from a small claim. Good people." "I'm sure," she said. "But who are they?" "You'll meet them when they come," he said. It wasn't an answer, and they both knew it. She studied the side of his face, the straight, undemonstrative line of it, the way he held himself as though careful not to take up more space than necessary. "You've worked here a long time?" she said. "Long enough," he said. "You're not from the bunkhouse." He glanced at her then. What do you mean? The other hands. They're friendly, they're loud, they play cards and the harmonica badly. You're not in the bunkhouse at night, I've noticed. Something shifted in his expression. A careful shift, the kind that meant he was deciding something. I've got a room in the East Wing, he said. Old arrangement. That's an unusual arrangement for a ranch hand. I've been here a long time, he said again. Nolan. She said his name the way she'd decided to say it, directly, without apology. I need to ask you something, and I need a straight answer because I'm trying to understand what's happening on this ranch, and I'm running out of the kind of patience that allows me to go at things slowly. He looked at her fully now. He had gray eyes, she noticed, clear and careful. Someone is stealing from this ranch, she said. Not small money. I mean property. Land. Actual parcels of Blackstone Summit are being transferred to shell companies through forged documentation, and it's been going on for at least 3 years, maybe longer. I have documentation, not everything, but enough to establish the pattern. Nolan said nothing. I also believe, she continued, that the same operation, or one very much like it, was used to take my family's ranch 2 years ago, in a different county, different personnel, but the same architecture. He was very still. So I need to know, she said, whether you're part of this or whether you're not, because I'm going to keep working on this regardless, but I'd like to know who I'm sharing a yard with. The silence that followed was the kind that had weight to it. The gelding snorted softly in the dark. Somewhere across the yard, a door opened and shut. I'm not part of it, Nolan said. His voice was quiet and level, and she believed him, which troubled her slightly because she'd believed people before and been wrong. But she also trusted at some point the evidence of observation, and what she'd observed of Nolan over 2.5 weeks was a man who fixed things early in the morning and didn't take credit and paid careful attention to things that other people dismissed. How much do you know about it? She asked. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, it was measured, like someone choosing each word from a smaller set than usual. I know there are problems. I've suspected there were problems for longer than I should have let them go unaddressed. I wasn't certain enough to act. What would you need to be certain enough? He looked at her steadily. What you have. She studied him. Then we should probably compare notes, she said. He held her gaze for a moment longer than was strictly conversational. Probably, he said. Come to the East Wing after the bunkhouse quiets down. I'll put coffee on. She went back to the main house. She sat at her desk and looked at the ledgers without seeing them for a full 2 minutes, which was unusual for her. Then she picked up her pen and got back to work. The East Wing was separated from the main house by a short covered walkway she'd always assumed led to storage. It didn't. It led to a set of 3 rooms that were simply and neatly furnished. Not the sparse impersonality of a bunkhouse, but the deliberate minimalism of someone who'd thought about what they needed and stopped there. A wood stove, a wide oak table with chairs, bookshelves, actual bookshelves with a varied and not particularly decorative collection of volumes, engineering manuals, land law references, 2 histories of Montana Territory, a worn collection of geological survey reports. She took that in quickly. It told her something. Nolan was already at the stove. He poured 2 cups and set them on the table without ceremony. She sat down. He sat across from her, and they looked at each other like 2 people deciding simultaneously how much to trust the situation. What's your full name? She said. Nolan Blackstone, he said. She absorbed that. Blackstone Summit Ranch. Blackstone. Are you related to the family that owns this ranch? He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. In a manner of speaking, he said, Nolan. I own it, he said. I'm the owner. She set her cup down. You're working as a ranch hand on your own property. I'm not working as a ranch hand. I'm working the ranch. There's a difference. He looked at her evenly. I have always worked my own land. My father worked it before me. The title is mine, but the labor is shared. It's not theater. It's how I was raised and how I believe this operation should run. She wanted to think clearly, and she was having some difficulty. Then why does Moss? Because Moss runs the administrative operations, Nolan said. The payroll, the contracts, the supplier arrangements, the correspondence. I trusted him with that for 4 years. He came with strong references, and he paused, effective at appearing capable. He's been stealing from you. I believe he has. I also believe he's not working alone. Nolan's jaw was tight, though his voice stayed even. Last spring, I noticed a boundary marker in the north pasture that wasn't where it should have been. I pulled the survey files and found discrepancies. When I asked Moss about it, he produced documentation that looked correct and I couldn't immediately disprove it. A pause. I should have pushed harder. Yes, she said, because it was true and softening it didn't help either of them. He looked at her for a moment. Yes, he agreed. Who hired me? She asked. Moss placed the advertisement. He selected me? I placed the advertisement, Nolan said. Moss handles correspondence, but I review hiring decisions. I chose you. Based on what? Your previous employment, the letter of character from the attorney in Bozeman, and the fact that you were previously employed by the Harper family ranch before they lost it, which told me you'd seen land fraud up close and would know what to look for. The coffee cup was warm in her hands. She made herself keep holding it, keep her posture normal, keep her voice level. You know what happened to my family's ranch? I know some of it, he said. I investigated the same land syndicate that I suspected was operating here. The Harper case came up in that investigation. I'm sorry about your family's losses, Miss Harper. It was a genuine and serious harm. You investigated, she said, on your own, with some legal assistance. But yes, and you brought me here because I needed someone with the specific skills and the specific experience and the specific, he considered his word, motivation to look at these records without flinching or being bought off or being frightened away. 3 previous employees flinched or were frightened. I needed someone who had personal reasons not to look away. She sat with that for a moment. It was a calculated decision, bringing her here for those reasons. It was also, she understood, an honest one. The previous bookkeeper, she said. August. I don't know what happened to her specifically, he said. His voice was careful, but there was something underneath it. She left without notice. I'm concerned. You should be, Evelyn said. I found the file she hid behind the loose board. She was building the same case I'm building. She got far enough to hide evidence before she left. A pause. Or before she was made to leave. Nolan looked at her steadily. I know, he said. That's why I need this resolved quickly, and carefully, and with enough documentation that no one can undo it after the fact. Then I need access to everything, she said. Every file, every contract, every survey. Not what Moss gives me access to. Everything. You'll have it, he said. She looked at him across the table. This man who owned half a mountain and fixed fences at 4 a.m. and drank plain coffee and looked at you like he was actually listening. She thought about trust, which was the thing she'd decided after losing the ranch she would never extend carelessly again. She thought about the $864 she'd traced through the payroll ledgers and the shell companies and the name Consolidated Western Properties appearing in 2 different frauds in 2 different counties, and the survey reports on Nolan Blackstone's shelves alongside the land law references. One more question, she said. All right, he said. What's in the north pasture, the section with the misplaced boundary marker? He looked at her for a long moment. A railway survey corridor, he said. Identified 18 months ago for a potential northern branch line, worth considerable money to whoever controls the access rights. She understood then, not just the scope of it, the reason for it, the reason for all of it. That's what this is really about, she said. Yes, he said. She finished her coffee. She set the cup down on the table with a small, quiet sound in the still room. Outside the covered walkway, the wind had come up, pushing through the pines in long, cold gusts. I'm going to need more paper, she said, and access to your telegraph account. And I want everything out of the hidden survey files in the barn. Yes, I know there are more. I found the pattern of the hiding places on my desk by morning. Nolan looked at her for another of those direct moments. Then something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile, but near one, the way a mountain is near the sky without quite being it. Good night, Miss Harper, he said. She walked back to the main house through the cold, her mind already sorting through what came next, what they needed, what they were up against, and how much time they had before someone realized that the new bookkeeper wasn't going to be frightened or bought or quietly made to disappear. She sat down at her desk. She picked up her pen. She started writing. She had the barn files on her desk by 5 a.m. Nolan hadn't asked how she'd known about them. He'd simply gone to the barn after their conversation, pulled 3 oilcloth-wrapped bundles from the spaces behind the grain storage bins where someone had wedged them years ago, and left them outside the office door without waking anyone. She found them when she came back from 2 hours of restless half-sleep that hadn't done much except give her a stiff neck and sharper nerves. She unwrapped the first bundle and got to work. The barn files were older than the office files. Some of the survey records went back to the original territorial land claim. The handwriting from a different era entirely, careful and deliberate in the way that people wrote when paper was expensive and mistakes were permanent. She worked through them chronologically, building a timeline in the margin of her notebook, small notations in her father's code that would mean nothing to anyone else. Property descriptions, boundary coordinates, transfer dates, names. The names were what she kept coming back to. Not Drummond. He was careful enough to keep his name off the primary documents. But the registered agents who appeared on the transfer paperwork formed a pattern she could now see clearly because she had enough of the pieces. 3 names rotated through the documents over a 6-year span. Different companies, different notarizations, different filing counties. But the same 3 names, cycling through like a car dealer working from a stacked deck. She wrote them down in a column and stared at them. Curtis knocked at 7 with breakfast. He set the plate down and noticed the spread of documents across the desk and said, carefully, "That's a lot of paper, ma'am." "It is," she agreed. "Mr. Moss know you've got all that out?" She looked at him. Curtis was 23 at most, with the guileless face of someone who hadn't yet learned to conceal his thoughts, and right now his thoughts were visible enough. He was worried about something and trying to decide whether to say it. "Is there something you want to tell me, Curtis?" He looked at the doorway, then back at her. "The fellow before you," he said. "Before Miss Alderman, there was a man, couple years back. Henderson was his name. He was doing the books, and then one day, he just wasn't here anymore." He paused. "Moss said he got a better offer somewhere, but Henderson had told me 2 days before that he was going to write to the Territorial Commissioner's office about something in the records, something he'd found." Evelyn set down her pen. "Did you tell anyone that?" "I told Moss," Curtis said. And then, with the painful honesty of someone realizing too late that he'd made a mistake 2 years ago that he couldn't go back and fix, he said Henderson was always making things bigger than they were, that it was nothing. "All right," she said. She kept her voice even. "Thank you, Curtis." He left. She sat with that information for a moment. Henderson, then presumably the woman named Alderman who'd hidden the files behind the loose board, and now her. And then she picked up her pen and went back to the timeline. Moss found the east wing door open at 8:30. She heard him from the covered walkway, his voice carrying the sharp edge of a man surprised into anger. "What in the hell is this?" And then Nolan's voice, lower, measured, and she couldn't make out the words, but she could hear the tone. The particular quality of someone who is not backing up. She stayed at her desk. After about 4 minutes, the voices stopped. Then Nolan appeared in the office doorway, and behind him, a half step back, Moss, whose face had gone the particular color of a man managing rage poorly. "Mr. Moss has some concerns," Nolan said. His voice was entirely neutral. "I'm sure he does," Evelyn said. Moss stepped around Nolan and came to the edge of the desk. He looked at the documents spread across it. She watched his eyes move across the papers, calculating, and she'd been careful enough that nothing visible was conclusive. The individual sheets showed survey records, which she could legitimately claim she was cross-referencing for the accounts. But the quantity of them, the spread and organization of them, the notebook with its columns of dates and names, that told a different story. "Where did those come from?" he said, pointing at the barn files. "Storage," she said. "I'm doing a comprehensive review of the records. As I explained when I arrived, an accurate set of accounts requires understanding the full picture. Those files are not part of your accounts. Property holdings directly affect the asset valuation of the ranch, which is absolutely part of the accounts." She looked at him steadily. "Is there something specific in these records you'd like to discuss, Mr. Moss?" He stared at her. She could see him thinking. She'd gotten better at reading him in 3 weeks, at understanding the rhythm of his calculations. He was trying to determine how much she had, without asking in a way that confirmed she had anything at all. "Put those back where you found them," he said finally. "Today." "When I finish the review," she said. "Today, Harper." "Mr. Blackstone," she said, not looking away from Moss. "Do you want me to put these back before I finish the review?" There was a beat of silence. "No," Nolan said. Moss turned to look at him. Something happened in Moss's expression. A shift, quick and then suppressed, and Evelyn caught it. Confusion. Not rage, not frustration, but actual confusion. The kind that suggested Nolan's answer had been unexpected in a way that went beyond this particular argument. "Nolan," Moss said slowly, These records are ranch business. She's ranch staff, Nolan said. Let her work. Another silence, different in quality. Then Moss turned and walked out of the office. His boot heels on the floorboards were very deliberate going down the hallway. Evelyn looked at Nolan. He looked back at her. Something had shifted between them. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, but in the way that things shift when two people have been through a version of the same fire and both know it. He'll start watching everything now, she said. He was already watching everything, Nolan said. Now he knows you're aware of it. Then we don't have as long as I thought. No, he said. We probably don't. She sent the first telegraph that afternoon. Nolan's account, his authorization, but her words, carefully constructed to say everything that needed saying without saying it plainly enough to be intercepted and understood. She'd worked out the language over her midday break, something that read like a business inquiry about territorial land registry procedures while actually requesting that a specific attorney in Billings pull their registration records for 4 named companies and compare the filing agents to a list she'd send in a follow-up wire. The telegraph operator at the nearest station was in Harmon, 6 miles down the mountain. Nolan rode down himself and sent the wire and was back before 4 o'clock, which she appreciated because it meant he'd ridden fast in both directions. The response will take 2 days at least, he said. I know. She was working through the 3rd bundle of barn files, building out the registry of shell companies. I've already started on the next piece. I need the water rights records. He looked at her. The water rights. The railway corridor is worthless without water access for the steam engines, she said, which means anyone acquiring that corridor quietly would also need to acquire the adjacent water rights, or at least they'd want to. She looked up. Are there water rights disputes on this property? He sat down heavily in the chair across the desk. 2, he said, both in the last 18 months, both supposedly resolved. How are they resolved? Moss handled them. I signed documents he presented. His jaw tightened. I should have read them more carefully. She didn't tell him he should have. He already knew. Can you remember the names of the other parties in those disputes? He gave her 2 names. She wrote them down, checked them against her list of shell company names. One matched. There it is, she said. He leaned forward and looked at where her pen was pointing. He was quiet for a moment. That's a water rights transfer, he said. Dressed up as a dispute resolution, she said. Your signature is on it, which means it looks voluntary. But the consideration listed, the amount they supposedly paid you for the rights, is $40. I never received $40. No, she said. You didn't, because the $40 went to Consolidated Western Properties as a processing fee, and the water rights themselves went to Summit Ridge Holdings, which is the same company, which is Calder Drummond. She let that sit for a moment. He acquired your water rights for nothing, using your own signature, and you didn't know. Nolan was quiet. She let him be quiet. There was a kind of anger that needed space to sit before it became useful, and she'd learned to recognize it. I want to know, he said finally, every single thing they've taken. I know, she said. I'm building that list, and then I want to take it back. I know, she said again. That's what we're doing. The strangers arrived on a Thursday. There were 2 of them, riding in from the South Trail in the early afternoon. Evelyn was at the office window when they came into the yard, not obviously watching, just standing near the glass, which had become a habit in the past week. They were well mounted, which told her something. Ranch visitors came on working horses typically. These men were on animals that cost money, which meant they weren't drifters and they weren't neighboring ranchers making a social call. They spoke to Moss in the yard. She couldn't hear the words, but she watched the body language. Moss, with his arms crossed, nodding twice, then gesturing toward the south pasture. One of the strangers glanced toward the main house. Not the office window specifically, but the building. The glance was brief, and it was scanning rather than curious. They weren't visiting the ranch. They were looking at something about the ranch. She found Nolan at the corral fence 20 minutes later. 2 men, she said. Just rode in. Were with Moss for about 5 minutes. I saw them, he said. His eyes were on the south pasture where the 2 riders had gone. Didn't recognize either one. They're not here to buy cattle, she said. No, he agreed, which means Moss has told someone we're looking, she said, or someone else has noticed the telegraph traffic and put it together. She looked at him. How long do we have before the owner's visit? You mentioned it to me early on. That was before I knew you were the owner. Something moved in his face. It might have been embarrassment. I said that because I wasn't ready to tell you the rest of it. I was still deciding how much to trust you with. How's that working out? He looked at her sidelong. Better than expected, he said, and she heard the dry note in it, which was the closest he came to humor. Nolan. She kept her voice low. If those men are here because Moss sent word that the accounts are being properly investigated, then we have days, not weeks. They'll try to destroy the documents. They can't destroy what you've already sent to Billings. No, but I haven't sent enough yet. I need the water rights documentation, the full property transfer chain, and the forged survey records in one complete package. Right now, it's pieces. Pieces can be explained away. He looked at the south pasture. The two riders were small in the distance now, moving along the fence line. What do you need? Time, she said, and the original land grant document, the one from the Territorial Commission when your father first registered the claim. That's in the house, he said. My room, in a lockbox. That document is the foundation of everything else, she said. If it's altered, or if anything in the chain leading from it to the current holdings shows a break in legitimate title, the whole fraudulent transfer structure collapses. She looked at him directly. Is it intact, unchanged? I look at it every year, he said. It was intact last spring. I need to see it. He nodded. They walked back to the house separately, 5 minutes apart, which had become their habit when Moss or the hands were around. She was getting tired of that particular caution, of having to approach everything at an angle, of every conversation requiring a layer of performance on top of the actual thing. She understood why it was necessary. She was tired of it anyway. The land grant was intact. She studied it for 20 minutes at the table in Nolan's room, the original document on the table before her alongside the chain of conveyances that followed it. Each generation's transfer, recorded and notarized, leading cleanly to the current holder. Nolan James Blackstone, sole owner, recorded with the Territorial Land Office in Helena. Date of registration 3 years prior following his father's death. The chain was clean. That was the important thing. The chain from the original claim to Nolan was unimpeachable, which meant the fraudulent transfers, the shell company land grabs, the forged boundary adjustments, the manipulated water rights, all had to work around that chain rather than through it, and working around a clean chain of title left marks. They couldn't forge the primary title, she said, almost to herself, so instead they've been working on the edges, taking small parcels through paperwork that looks like voluntary transfers, acquiring water rights through manufactured dispute resolutions, slowly hollowing out the value of the ranch without ever touching the central title. Like stealing bricks from a building's foundation, Nolan said. He was standing near the window, arms crossed, not looking at the documents. Yes, she said, exactly like that. Until eventually the building collapses on its own and the title is worthless because the land it represents has been systematically reduced to nothing. She sat back. And the railway corridor parcel. That's the keystone. Once they have that, the rest of the surrounding land becomes dramatically more valuable, and by that point they've been acquiring it piece by piece for years. And I'd have nothing left to contest it with, he said. You'd have the primary title. But a primary title to a ranch that's been bled dry of its water rights and its most valuable land parcels is worth very little in practical terms. She looked at him. That's the elegance of it. They never have to steal the ranch outright. They just have to make it worthless while it's still technically yours. He was quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the pines in long, steady waves. This is what they did to your family, he said. It wasn't a question. Something similar, she said. Different tools. Same principle. She folded her hands on the table. My father was a careful man. Good with numbers, good with people, not naive. He didn't see it until the ranch was already gone. By the time we understood what had happened, there was nothing left to fight for. She paused. I spent a year afterward going through every document, working with attorneys, trying to understand the mechanism. Not to get it back. That was already finished. Just to understand how it worked. She looked down at her hands. So that if I'd ever saw it again, I would recognize it. You recognized it here, he said. Within a week, she said. The patterns are the same. Different names, different location, different details, same architecture. He looked at her for a moment. I'm sorry, he said, about your family's ranch. Don't be sorry, she said. Help me make sure it doesn't happen to yours. That night, for the first time since she'd arrived, she made an error. It was a small error, the kind that happened when exhaustion outran caution. She'd been working past midnight on the compilation document, the organized summary of evidence she was building to send to Billings. and she'd left it on the desk when she went to refill her coffee from the kitchen stove. Not face down, just left it out because she'd been alone in the house and wasn't thinking. She came back to find Moss in the office doorway. He was looking at the desk. He hadn't crossed the threshold. She registered that, noted it, but he was looking at the document from the doorway, and depending on the angle and how much of it was visible from there, he might have seen enough. She walked back to the desk at a normal pace, set the coffee down, turned the document over with one hand while picking up her pen with the other, making it look like she was simply reaching for a new page. Her heart was doing something unpleasant. She kept her face still. "Mr. Moss," she said, "is there something you need?" He looked at her. In the lamplight, his expression was unreadable in a way that was itself informative, the careful blankness of a man controlling his reaction to something. "Saw the light on," he said. "I work late," she said. "You knew that when you hired me." "I didn't hire you," he said. "I corresponded with you." Functionally the same thing. He looked at the overturned document, then at her. "You should get some sleep, Harper. Long day tomorrow. I'm sending some of the hands to the North Pasture, and I'll need updated supply records for the expedition." "I'll have them ready," she said. He left. She waited until she heard his bootsteps fade, then sat very still at the desk for a full minute. She couldn't be certain what he'd seen. She thought probably not enough to understand the full scope. But he'd seen something, and he was already suspicious, and the two strangers from the South Trail were still somewhere on or near the ranch. She put the document in the lining of her coat. Then she picked up her coffee and her pen and started a fresh copy from memory, keeping only what she could afford to lose if the first one was found. Curtis found her before breakfast the next morning with a face that had gone 2 shades pale. "The filing cabinet," he said, "in the storage room off the kitchen. Someone's been through it." She followed him to look. The cabinet was an old wooden piece used for storing completed payroll records and supplier contracts, documents she hadn't prioritized yet but had planned to get to. The drawers had been opened and the contents disturbed, not ransacked exactly, but gone through in a hurry by someone who knew what they were looking for. "When?" she said. "Sometime last night," Curtis said. "I was up early for the South Pasture and I came in through the kitchen and the drawer was open." He looked at her. "Miss Harper, what's going on here?" She looked at this 23-year-old with his sunburned neck and his honest face and his painful guilt about telling Moss what Henderson had said 2 years ago. "You already know something's wrong," she said. "You've known for a while." "I don't know specifics," he said carefully, "but you know the shape of it." He was quiet. "Curtis," she said, "do you trust Nolan?" He looked at her sharply. "Nolan? He's straight. Whatever you think about how things work here, Nolan's straight." "Good," she said. "That's what I needed to know. Go back to your regular work. Don't mention this to anyone." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to go through that cabinet and figure out what's missing," she said. "And then I'm going to figure out how to work around it." She spent 2 hours with the filing cabinet. The missing documents were, as she'd feared, a set of supplier contracts that contained names she'd been planning to use as corroborating evidence, third-party contractors who'd been paid from accounts that should have shown as ranch expenses but which she'd traced to the shell company network instead. Without those specific contracts, that particular thread of the evidence chain lost its strongest link. She thought about it. Then she thought about what she still had. The barn files, the property transfer chain, the water rights documentation, the original land grant, and the compilation she'd rebuilt from memory. It wasn't the full picture, but it was a coherent picture. A good attorney could work with a coherent picture. She went to find Nolan. Howe was in the North Pasture, which was where she expected him to be, and she walked out to him across a ground that was hard with October frost and didn't apologize for interrupting whatever he was doing because they were past that particular courtesy. "Moss went through the storage room last night," she said. "Took the supplier contracts." Nolan's expression went tight. "Which ones?" She told him. He listened without interrupting, which she'd come to understand was how he absorbed bad news. He let it all in first and then dealt with it, rather than interrupting to argue with each piece. "We can replace some of that from memory," she said. "I have records of the amounts and dates. Without the originals, it's weaker, but it's not nothing." "He knows you're building a case," Nolan said. "He suspected it for a week. Now he's certain." She looked across the North Pasture at the fence line that marked the edge of the property, beyond which the Railway Corridor Survey had placed its stakes. How long before he takes action beyond stealing documents? Nolan looked out at the same fence line. "He sent a wire from Harmon 3 days ago," he said. "I found out this morning from the telegraph operator. I have an arrangement with him to tell me about unusual traffic." His voice was flat. Moss wired someone in Helena. The operator couldn't read the whole message, but got enough. It mentioned an external review of records and requested instructions. "Drummond," she said. "Most likely." She thought about the two strangers in the yard. She thought about Drummond and Helena receiving Moss's wire, calculating. She thought about the railway corridor and what it was worth, and what a man who'd spent 6 years carefully constructing a scheme to steal it would be willing to do to protect it. "Then we don't have days," she said. "We have hours." "I've been thinking the same thing," Nolan said. He looked at her. There was something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not fear exactly, but the honest weight of a man who'd been holding too much alone for too long. "I should have moved on this sooner. I knew something was wrong, and I moved too carefully, and now—" "Nolan," she said. Not sharply. Just firmly enough to interrupt the path he was going down. "You moved carefully because you wanted it to stick, because you'd seen what happened when accusations couldn't be proven. That was the right instinct, even if the timing is hard now." She paused. "We have enough. Maybe not everything I wanted, but enough." "You sound certain," he said. "I'm not," she said honestly, "but I'm certain enough to move." He looked at her for a long moment. The wind came across the pasture in a cold, straight line, lifting the edges of her coat, and she didn't move against it. Nolan's gray eyes were steady and direct, and she thought, not for the first time, but more clearly than before, that whatever he was, whatever he'd built and owned and hidden, he was a man who looked at hard things without flinching. She found that unexpectedly important. "We send everything to Billings tonight," he said. "The full compilation, whatever we have." "Yes," she said, "and we need to get off this ranch before Drummond's response to Moss's wire arrives." She met his eyes. "Because when it does, those two strangers in the yard won't be here to look anymore. They'll be here to act." He absorbed that, nodded once. "How long do you need to prepare the documents?" 4 hours, she said. "Maybe 5. "I'll have horses ready," he said. She turned and walked back toward the house, her boots loud on the frozen ground, her mind already moving through the order of operations. What to copy, what to carry, what to leave, how to package it for a hard ride through mountain passes in October. Behind her, she heard Nolan begin moving too, his footsteps taking a different direction. Neither of them ran. Running told people something was wrong before you were ready for them to know it, but they moved with the particular velocity of people who understood, with precise and unhesitating clarity, that time had just become the most important resource they had. She worked for 4 hours and 20 minutes without stopping. The compilation document she rebuilt from memory was better than the original. She understood that in the way you sometimes understand things when your back is fully against a wall and there's no longer any room for hesitation or second guessing. The first version had been careful, organized, professionally constructed. This version was all of that and something more. It had the particular economy of a document written by someone who knew they might only get one chance to hand it to a judge and who could not afford a single unnecessary word. She worked through the property transfer chain first, laying out each fraudulent conveyance in sequence, linking each shell company name to the filing agents she'd identified, connecting the filing agents through the territorial registration records to Calder, Drummond, and Helena. Then the water rights. Then the wage theft. Smaller in scale, but important because it established pattern and duration, demonstrated that this operation had been running systematically for years, rather than representing a few opportunistic errors. Then the railway corridor, last and most important, the purpose around which everything else had been constructed. She cross-referenced every claim against the documents she still had in hand, noting the specific file and page number for each. An attorney reading this would be able to pull the supporting evidence for every assertion without having to take her word for anything. Nolan appeared in the doorway at the 3-hour mark. He looked at the desk, at her, at the organized stacks of documents she'd sorted into carry and leave piles. He didn't say anything about the state of the room, which was considerable. He said, "Moss just sent one of the hands to Harmon on a fast horse." She looked up. "Another wire? I don't know. Maybe. Or a message by hand." He came into the office and stood near the window, looking out at the yard with the posture of a man conducting surveillance while appearing to simply stand. "The two strangers from yesterday are back. They came in from the north trail this time. They're at the barn." "They're watching the exits," she said. "That's what it looks like." She thought about that. "Curtis," she said, "can he be trusted to take a package to Harmon without going through Moss?" "I think so," Nolan said. "But if those two men are watching the north trail, "There's another way to Harmon," she said. "Through the Alderman Creek Draw. It's longer, but it doesn't cross open ground." He looked at her. "How do you know about the Alderman Creek Draw?" "The survey maps," she said. "I've been looking at them for 3 weeks." She went back to writing. "Find Curtis. Tell him to take the creek draw, ride to Harmon, and send a wire to the attorney in Billings. I'll have the text ready in 20 minutes. Tell him to confirm delivery and come straight back. And if Moss notices he's gone, tell Moss you sent him to check the east fence line. That's plausible." Nolan was quiet for a moment. "You've gotten good at this," he said. Not admiringly, just factually the way he said most things. "I was good at it before I got here," she said. "I just had better reasons to use it now." He left to find Curtis. She finished the wire text in 16 minutes, not 20, because she'd been composing it in her head while she wrote and could transfer it directly to paper. She folded it, wrote Nolan's attorney contact in Billings on the outside, and had it ready when Curtis appeared in the doorway, looking frightened and determined in equal measure. "The creek draw," she said. "No matter what, don't let anyone follow you." "Yes, ma'am," he said. And then, with the expression of someone deciding something that mattered, "I'm sorry about Henderson. I've been sorry about that for 2 years." "I know," she said. "Go." She was still working when she heard the argument. It came from the yard, Moss's voice, raised past his usual carefully controlled register into something rawer and less managed. Then another voice, one she didn't immediately recognize, clipped and impatient. She went to the window. The two strangers were no longer at the barn. They were in the yard, and one of them was talking to Moss with the body language of a man delivering instructions rather than having a conversation. Moss was nodding, but the nod was tight and reluctant, the nod of someone being told something they don't like by someone they can't refuse. Evelyn watched for 30 seconds. Then she went to find Nolan. He was in the east wing, and when she came through the covered walkway, she found him pulling a locked tin box from the shelf above the door. The kind of box that held documents too important for a standard desk drawer. He looked up when she came in and didn't seem surprised to see her. "They're giving Moss instructions," she said. "One of them is in charge." "I saw." He set the box on the table and opened it with a small key from his vest pocket. Inside were documents she hadn't seen before. A stack of correspondence in one bundle, tied with twine, and beneath it a folded paper that looked like a legal document. "This is what I didn't show you before," he said. He put the folded paper on the table. "I wasn't ready." She unfolded it. It was a letter from an attorney in Helena, not Drummond, a different name, dated 8 months ago. She read it quickly. It was a formal notification that a claim had been filed in territorial court challenging the boundary of the North Pasture parcel, specifically the section that contained the railway corridor. The claimant was identified as Summit Ridge Holdings. They were already in court. 8 months ago. Nolan had known. She looked at him. "I engaged my own attorney," he said, "in Billings. He reviewed the claim and said it had procedural problems and that it would likely be dismissed." He paused. "It wasn't dismissed. The hearing is in 6 weeks." 6 weeks, she said. "That's why they're moving now. That's why Moss sent for help." She looked at the letter again. "If they can discredit the records before the hearing. If they can establish that the ranch's own bookkeeper identified inconsistencies that suggest the boundary dispute is legitimate, they can win in court without ever needing to produce a forged document in front of a judge. They need my own records to work against me," he said. "Or they need the records to disappear entirely, which leaves the court with nothing to weigh against their claim." She refolded the letter, which is why they took the supplier contracts last night, and why those two men are here now. She set the letter down and looked at him directly. "Nolan, we can't wait for Curtis to get back from Harmon. We need to move tonight." He looked at the document, at the window, at her. "The hearing is in Helena," he said. "Then we go to Helena," she said, "with everything we have. We present it to your attorney there and file supplemental evidence with the court before the hearing." She picked up the folded letter. "This letter proves you've been engaged in good faith. The evidence we've compiled proves the claimant is fraudulent. Together, that's a case. It's a 2-day ride to Helena from here," he said, "through mountain passes in October." "I know," she said. "Those men in the yard will follow us." "Probably," she said. "But they'll follow us through the same passes in the same weather and we'll have a head start." She looked at him. "Unless you think it's better to stay." He didn't answer immediately. He was looking at the lockbox, at the stack of correspondence inside it. Then he reached in and pulled out the correspondence bundle, untied the twine, and separated 3 letters from the rest. "These are from other ranchers," he said. 3 families whose properties border mine to the south and east. All 3 have had boundary disputes in the past 2 years. All 3 were resolved through Moss's paperwork. He held them out to her. I wrote to them 6 months ago asking about their experiences. These are their replies. She took the letters and read them quickly. They were from ordinary people, not legal professionals. A widow named Margaret Fowler, a family named the Callahans, a man named Ezra Webb. And they were written in the plain language of people describing something that had happened to them without fully understanding the mechanism. But the descriptions fit the pattern exactly. Boundary disputes that appeared from nowhere, paperwork that resolved them quickly, small parcels that ended up in different hands. They're victims too, she said. They don't know it yet, he said. Or they know something is wrong but they don't know what, or they don't have the resources to fight it. She looked at the letters in her hand. 3 families. 3 sets of losses they didn't fully understand. The architecture of the scheme was wider than even she'd mapped. Drummond hadn't just been targeting Blackstone Summit's railway corridor. He'd been acquiring surrounding properties too, assembling a contiguous landmass that would control not just the corridor itself, but every viable approach to it. These letters go with us, she said, and tomorrow morning, before we leave, I want to write to each of these families directly, telling them what's happening, giving them enough information to contact your attorney in Billings on their own behalf. We won't have time, he said. I'll make time, she said. They deserve to know. He looked at her for a moment with the particular expression she'd come to associate with him coming to a decision about something. All right, he said. I'll start getting the horses ready. We leave 3 hours before dawn. She wrote 3 letters in 2 hours, which left very little margin and no time for second-guessing the language. She wrote them the way she'd learned to write difficult letters, plainly, with specific information rather than general alarm, giving each family enough concrete detail to act on without overwhelming them with the full scope of what she'd uncovered. She sealed them and left them with specific instructions for the ranch hand she trusted most after Curtis, a quiet older man named Braddock who had the face of someone who'd seen enough in his life to take extraordinary things in stride. See those get to the post, she told him. Tomorrow, not through Moss, through the Harmon station directly. Braddock looked at the 3 envelopes. Things going badly, he said. Things are being handled, she said. But some people need to know what's happening. He took the letters without further question and put them in his inside vest pocket. She appreciated that about him. She went back to the office and packed the documents. She'd worked out a system during her hours of compilation. The most critical items went inside her coat directly against her body. The secondary documents went into the saddlebag. The copies she'd made of things she'd already sent to Billings were separated out and wrapped in oilcloth. Insurance against the primary set being lost, though she tried not to think too hard about what losing the primary set would require. At 2 a.m, she heard boots on the porch and went still. Then she recognized the tread, Nolan's step, the lighter one, and let her breath out. He put his head in the doorway. Curtis is back, he said quietly. Wire was sent. The attorney in Billings confirmed receipt. Something in her chest loosened very slightly. Good, she said. There's a problem with the horses, he said. She looked at him. The barn, he said. One of those strangers is sleeping in it. I think they're watching the horses deliberately. His jaw was set. I've got 2 horses in the side paddock. I moved them there last week for the east pasture work. They won't know about those. 2 horses for 2 people, she said. That works. It'll be a hard ride, he said. The passes are cold. Then we'd better dress for it, she said. He looked at her for a moment. At the packed documents, the organized desk, the coat she'd already put on. You're not afraid, he said. It sounded slightly like he was verifying something. I'm afraid of a great many things, she said. I'm just not letting that make the decisions right now. He was quiet. Then he said, My father used to say something like that. He sounds like he was a sensible man, she said. He was, Nolan said. And then, because he was not a man who said things he didn't mean and rarely said them even when he did mean them, you would have liked him. She didn't have an answer for that. That wasn't too large for the moment, so she just picked up the saddlebag and said, Let's go. They cleared the paddock fence at 20 minutes before 3 a.m, moving northeast along the tree line rather than the main trail. The sky was clear and cold, the stars very bright and unhelpful in the way that clear October skies in Montana were, beautiful and indifferent, offering light just adequate enough to ride by and cold sufficient to make every breath sting. Evelyn had ridden since childhood, which was one useful inheritance from a ranching family. She wasn't the rider Nolan was. No one who hadn't grown up on Montana terrain would be. But she could hold a pace and manage a difficult horse and stay upright in cold weather, which was the minimum required. They didn't speak for the first hour. There wasn't anything to say that improved on silence, and sound carried strangely in mountain air at night. She rode and thought and let the rhythm of the horse settle her nerves into something more functional. They were 2 miles out when she heard the first rider behind them. She didn't hear it consciously at first. It was a felt thing, a rhythm that didn't match the wind or the trees or the natural sounds of the mountain. She looked at Nolan. He was already looking back. They found the paddock, he said. Low flat. 1 rider or 2? He listened for a moment. 1, he said. Maybe 2. Hard to tell yet. How far to the pass? Another 4 miles. Trail narrows significantly about halfway through. She thought about that. A narrow trail in the dark with a rider behind them. If we push to the narrows and they're only 1, we don't know they're only 1, he said. No, she agreed, but we know standing still doesn't help us. She looked at him. Can we make the narrows before they close the gap? He assessed the distance, the terrain, the sound of pursuit behind them, with the particular speed of a man who'd made operational decisions on horseback before. If we push the horses, he said. Push them, she said. They went from a controlled canter to something harder, the horses working up the rocky trail with the kind of urgency that came from competent riding rather than panic. The trees on either side thickened and the trail climbed, the gradient increasing as they moved into the first serious elevation of the pass. The cold cut harder at speed. She pulled her coat tighter with one hand and kept the other on the reins and didn't look back. The sound of pursuit either fell back or was swallowed by the terrain. She couldn't tell which and couldn't afford to stop to figure it out. The trail narrowed exactly where Nolan had said it would. Rock walls rising on both sides, the path barely wide enough for 2 horses abreast. They went through single file, Nolan ahead, and she watched the set of his shoulders and followed his line exactly, trusting his knowledge of the terrain over her own instincts. They came through the narrows into a wider shelf and Nolan pulled up. She came alongside him and they both listened. The pursuit sound was there, closer than she'd hoped, not as close as she'd feared. 1 rider, she thought, definitely 1. Just 1, Nolan confirmed quietly. But there'll be more coming from a different direction. Drummond's men will know the passes. Then we don't stop, she said. We can't outrun them all the way to Helena, he said. Not in 1 push. I know that. She looked at the trail ahead. Descending now into a long valley, she could see an outline under the stars. What's at the bottom of this valley? Little settlement called Red Pine. 6 buildings, a trading post. Telegraph, she asked. He thought. No. But there's a man there. Hollis Greer. He runs the trading post. Who's known me since I was 12 years old and who does not like Gerald Moss at all. Why? Moss cheated him out of a winter supply contract 3 years ago and replaced him with one of Drummond's companies. Hollis knows he was cheated and he's been waiting for someone to do something about it for 3 years. She absorbed that. Then, Hollis Greer is exactly who we need right now, she said. Red Pine at 3:30 in the morning was dark, except for 1 window in the trading post where a lamp burned low. Nolan knocked twice, paused, knocked once more in a pattern that was clearly familiar, and after a minute, the door opened. Hollis Greer was in his 60s, broad as a barn door, with a white beard he hadn't trimmed recently and eyes that were sharp enough to cut glass. He took in Nolan, then Evelyn, then the horses behind them, then the direction they'd come from, and stepped back from the door. Figured someone would come through here in a hurry someday, he said. Didn't figure it'd be you specifically, but here we are. Hollis, Nolan said. We need 20 minutes and a back way out of town. You need coffee in 20 minutes, Hollis corrected him. You look like you've been riding in the cold for an hour. We have, Evelyn said, and we have someone behind us on the pass trail. Hollis looked at her with open assessment. Who are you? Evelyn Harper. I'm the bookkeeper at Blackstone Summit. Were, Nolan said quietly. She looked at him. He had a point. She probably couldn't go back to the ranch, technically, and then she put that aside because it wasn't the immediate problem. Moss sent riders after us, she said to Hollis. We're carrying evidence to Helena for a court proceeding. Hollis's expression, which had been cautious, shifted into something harder and more decided. Evidence about what? The supply contract he took from you 3 years ago, she said, and approximately 40 other fraudulent transactions involving your neighbors and the families in this region. She paused. If we reach Helena with what we're carrying, the court proceeding will likely unwind the entire scheme, which means there's a reasonable chance you get restitution for the contract. Hollis looked at her for a long 5 seconds. Then he looked at Nolan. She always talked this directly? Yes, Nolan said. Good. Hollis stepped back further. Come in. There's a back trail east of the woodpile that drops down to the lower valley road. Takes an extra hour, but it doesn't cross the main pass at any point. Anyone waiting on the pass won't see you go. They went in. He poured coffee that was stronger than anything she'd had since Billings and set out bread and cold meat without being asked. And Evelyn ate standing up because sitting down felt like a commitment to staying that she wasn't ready to make. Nolan spread the county map Hollis produced on the table, and the two men talked terrain. Valley roads, creek crossings, the location of a ranch south of Red Pine, whose owner Nolan knew would let them change horses if they needed to. Evelyn listened and ate and watched Hollis, this man who'd been quietly wronged by the same operation and who was responding to it, the way she imagined most people in this region responded to things, practically without fanfare, with the direct helpfulness of someone who understood that in isolated country, cooperation was not optional. The man behind us on the pass, she said when the map conversation paused. If he reaches Red Pine, he won't find anything, Hollis said, and if he asks questions, he'll get the kind of answers that send him north instead of east. She looked at him. You do that without knowing more than I've told you? I do that knowing you're going against Moss, he said simply. That's enough for me. And they left through the back trail 20 minutes later, the horses rested enough and the sky beginning to shift from deep black to the first dark blue of approaching dawn. The trail Hollis had described was real and exactly where he said it was, dropping down through dense timber to a valley road that ran southeast between ridgelines tall enough to block sight lines from the main pass. Nolan rode beside her in the early morning dark, and for a while there was just the sound of the horses and the creak of leather and the wind moving through the high timber. You handled Hollis well, he said. I told him the truth, she said. That's usually enough with people who've been lied to already. He was quiet for a moment. There's something I want to say. She waited. When I brought you to the ranch, he said, it was calculated. I chose you specifically because of your history, because of what happened to your family. I used that. His voice was even, but she could hear the effort in it. I want to acknowledge that because it wasn't entirely right, even if the reasons were good. She thought about it. You gave me honest work for honest pay, she said, and when I found the fraud, you told me the truth about who you were. She looked at the trail ahead. My family's history is mine to use as I see fit. You didn't use it against me, you used it alongside me. She paused. There's a difference. He didn't respond immediately. Then, my father would have said the same thing. Then he was right twice, she said. The sky continued to lighten. The cold was the deepest it had been. The hour before dawn, when the temperature dropped one final degree before the sun's approach began to push it back. She could feel the documents against her ribs through her coat. The compilation, the land grant copy, the water rights records, the letters from the Fowler widow and the Callahans and Ezra Webb, everything they had. They'd been riding for another hour and the valley road had climbed back into higher terrain when Nolan held up his hand and they both stopped. Riders ahead. Not behind. Ahead. She counted the sound. 2, maybe 3 horses moving at a controlled pace down the trail toward them. Not chasing, not fleeing, just moving, meeting them. Nolan reached inside his coat. She didn't know what he carried, had never asked, had assumed something because this was the frontier and he'd worked his own land for a decade. She did not reach for anything herself because she had nothing to reach for and had been operating on the assumption that the documents in her coat were both her only weapon and the thing that most needed protecting. The riders came around a bend in the trail. There were 3 of them. In the early light, she couldn't make out faces until they were 20 yards away. One of them was Curtis. The other 2 were men she didn't know. Older, weathered, with the look of people who worked land rather than law, but riding with a purposefulness that wasn't casual. Curtis pulled up, and his relief at seeing them was so visible it was almost painful to look at. I went back to the ranch, he said. When I got back from Harmon and you were gone, Braddock told me which way you'd headed. I got Tanner and Reese to come with me. He gestured at the 2 men beside him. They've worked the ranch for 8 years. They know what Moss has been doing. Not all of it, but enough. Nolan looked at the 2 men. The one named Tanner, who was somewhere past 50 with a face like dried leather, said, We're owed wages, Mr. Blackstone. 6 months' worth between the 2 of us. We'd like to see that resolved. You know who I am? Nolan said. We've known for 2 years, Tanner said. We're not stupid. We just didn't say anything because we didn't know who to say it to. He looked at Evelyn, until she came. Evelyn looked at Tanner, then at Reese, then at Curtis, and felt something shift in the calculation she'd been running. 3 additional witnesses with direct knowledge of the wage theft, 8 years of employment history between Tanner and Reese alone, and Curtis, who'd worked under Moss for 4 years and had seen enough to be afraid and enough to feel guilty about it. "You're willing to make statements to the court," she said. "We're willing to do what it takes to get our wages back," Tanner said. "If the court needs statements, sure." "It will," she said. She looked at Nolan. "This changes the case significantly." "I know," he said. "The wage theft becomes directly corroborated," she said, "which eliminates the only argument Drummond's attorneys could make against the payroll evidence, that it was an accounting error without the records to prove intent. With 2 witnesses who can testify to the amounts they're owed and the pattern by which it was taken, then it's not an accounting dispute," Nolan said. "It's theft, provable theft, which establishes criminal intent across the broader scheme," she said. "The property fraud and the wage fraud use the same mechanism. If we can prove one is deliberate, it supports the argument that both are." Tanner looked between them with the patient expression of a man who didn't entirely follow the legal reasoning but understood the direction. "So, we're all going to Helena then?" "We're all going to Helena," Nolan said. They reorganized and rode out together, 5 of them now, where there had been 2, down the valley road toward the lower passes that would take them south and east through the mountains toward the territorial capital. The sky was fully light now, cold and clear, the kind of October morning that was beautiful in an entirely uncompromising way. She rode near the middle of the group and thought about what she had: the documents against her ribs, 3 witnesses willing to testify, a property owner with a clean title chain and the knowledge to explain every element of what had been done to his land, and an attorney in Billings already holding the preliminary evidence wire. Behind them somewhere, Moss's men were on the wrong trail or the right trail, but too far back. Ahead of them, 2 days of mountain riding and whatever the territorial courthouse would require. She thought about the hearing 6 weeks away and what it would look like to walk into that courtroom with what they were carrying and what it would mean if they made it. She thought about Calder Drummond and Helena, receiving Moss's wire, making his calculations, believing he still had time. He didn't have time. She intended to make very sure of that. The valley road curved south between the ridgelines, and Nolan moved his horse up alongside hers for a moment without speaking, just present, and she found that she didn't mind that at all. The simple fact of someone steady beside her in cold air, riding hard towards something worth riding toward. She kept her hand on the reins and her eyes on the trail ahead and didn't look back. They rode through the second night in shifts. It had been Tanner's idea, practical and unglamorous in the way that Tanner's ideas tended to be. 2 people sleep in the saddle while 3 stay alert, rotate every 2 hours, push through until dawn rather than camping and giving pursuit the chance to close ground while they were stationary. Evelyn had agreed immediately. Nolan had said nothing, which meant he agreed too. Sleeping in a saddle was not sleep in any restorative sense. It was more like a negotiation between exhaustion and the body's survival instinct. The mind going soft at the edges while some deeper part stayed connected to the horse and the motion and the cold air. She'd managed it twice during the Harper Ranch years when her father needed help moving cattle across distances that didn't fit into daylight. She managed it now, leaning slightly forward with her hands loose on the reins, and when Curtis touched her shoulder at the 2-hour mark, she came back to full awareness in the practiced way of someone who'd learned that the luxury of a slow waking wasn't always available. The mountains gave way to foothills some time before dawn. She noticed the change in the quality of the cold first, less sharp, less mineral, and then the change in the tree line, the pines thinning and the ground opening up into longer sightlines. Helena was still most of a day ahead of them, but the terrain was no longer working against them. They stopped at a creek to water the horses, and Nolan came to stand beside her while the animals drank. "You should eat something," he said. He held out a piece of hard bread from Hollis's trading post that he'd been carrying in his coat pocket. She took it. "You should sleep." "I slept," he said. "For 40 minutes, she said. "I counted." He looked at the creek. "I kept thinking about the hearing," he said. "The filing deadline. If Drummond's attorneys have already submitted additional evidence to the court, anything to complicate our standing. Your attorney in Billings has the preliminary wire," she said. "He'll have filed a notice of supplemental evidence by now. That protects our position until we can appear in person." She ate the bread, which was hard enough to require concentration. "Stop catastrophizing. It doesn't help, and you're bad at it." He looked at her with an expression that might have been offense and might have been something else. bad at catastrophizing, he said. You do it thoroughly, but without any productive outcome, she said, which is the worst kind. Tanner, who was nearby checking his horse's left foreleg, made a sound that was probably a suppressed laugh. Nolan glanced at him. Tanner became very interested in the hoof. The document with your signature on the water rights transfer, Evelyn said, returning to something she'd been turning over for the past hour of writing. The one where the consideration was listed as $40. Do you remember signing it? I remember Moss presenting me with a stack of papers one evening in July, Nolan said. He said they were routine, renewal of supply agreements, and some administrative updates to the land registry. I signed them. His jaw tightened. I signed 7 documents that evening without reading each one carefully. That's not unusual for someone running a large operation, she said, and that's part of what we need the court to understand. The scheme was specifically designed to function through ordinary business practice. Moss knew you trusted him with administration. I exploited that trust deliberately and systematically. She paused. The document you signed isn't evidence of your wrongdoing, it's evidence of his. My attorney said something similar, Nolan said. I found it less convincing coming from him. Because he's paid to reassure you, she said. I'm not. He was quiet for a moment. Then, quietly, no, you're not. They rode out from the creek as the sky began to lighten in the east, 5 riders moving at a ground-covering pace down the foothills road, and Evelyn thought about the 7 documents Nolan had signed in July without reading each one, and about her own father signing papers he'd trusted a man to prepare honestly, and about the particular vulnerability of people who built things through work and faith in other people, and how that same faith was the precise mechanism through which everything could be taken. She thought about justice, which she'd stopped believing in for about a year after losing the Harper Ranch. Not entirely. She'd never quite reached the point of full disbelief, but close enough that the word had tasted hollow for a long time. She was aware, riding toward Helena with documents pressed against her ribs and 3 ranch hands at her back, that it didn't taste hollow anymore. That was not something she'd expected to recover. They reached the outskirts of Helena in the mid-afternoon of the second day, road dirty and stiff and smelling considerably of horse, which was not the ideal presentation for approaching a territorial courthouse, but was the presentation they had. Nolan's attorney was a man named Prescott, Franklin Prescott, 45, with the kind of organized desk that told Evelyn he was the right kind of lawyer for this situation. He had received the preliminary wire. He had, as she'd anticipated, filed a notice of supplemental evidence with the court, and he looked at the documents she laid on his desk with the expression of a man who had hoped for ammunition and received considerably more than he'd expected. This is the full property transfer chain, he said, lifting one section. Cross-referenced against the territorial registration records, she said. Each shell company identified, each filing agent named, the connection to Drummond established through the registration chain rather than through assertion. And this, he picked up the water rights documentation. This is the July transfer. Signed by Mr. Blackstone under misrepresentation, she said. The consideration listed, $40, was never paid. I have the payroll and expense ledgers for the relevant period showing no such payment received. The funds instead appear as a processing fee routed to Consolidated Western Properties. She pointed to the specific ledger page she'd copied. Same company, same routing pattern as the wage theft. Prescott looked at Nolan. You understand that your signature on this document will be raised by opposing counsel. Yes, Nolan said. And you're prepared to testify to the circumstances under which you signed it. Yes, Nolan said again. I signed 7 documents that evening. Moss presented them as routine administrative papers. I did not read the water rights transfer carefully because I had no reason to believe it was anything other than what he described. Were there witnesses to that presentation? Nolan thought. Curtis was in the house that evening. He brought supper to the office where Moss and I were working. Curtis, who was sitting against the far wall of Prescott's office with his hat in his hands, looked up. Yes, sir, he said. I remember that evening. Mr. Moss had a stack of papers out on the desk and said they were just renewals. Use that word specifically. Renewals. Prescott looked at Curtis with the assessing expression of an attorney calculating the value of a witness. You'd be willing to testify to that? Yes, sir, Curtis said. I've been willing to do something useful about the situation for 2 years. I'd like to do it now while I have the chance. Prescott turned to Tanner and Reese, who were sitting beside Curtis with the same hat and hands posture of people in an unfamiliar formal setting trying to behave correctly. And you too, the wage amounts. You can specify exact figures and dates? Tanner reached into his shirt and produced a folded piece of paper. Wrote it all down on the ride, he said. Every month, the amount I was shorted, what I was paid versus what the posted rate was. 6 years' worth. Reese has the same for 4 years. Prescott took the paper, looked at it, then looked at Evelyn. You prompted them to document this. On the ride down, she said, I told them what the court would need. He set the paper on the desk alongside the documents she'd brought. He looked at the collection of evidence for a long moment, the kind of moment where a man is genuinely recalculating something. Miss Harper, he said, what did you do before bookkeeping? Bookkeeping, she said, and watching my family lose their ranch to a similar scheme. He absorbed that. I see. He began sorting the documents into ordered stacks with the focused efficiency of a professional who'd shifted from assessment to action. The hearing is in 4 weeks, but given the supplemental evidence notice I've already filed, I can request an emergency preliminary injunction hearing much sooner, within the week, if the judge's calendar permits. An injunction would freeze any further property transfers while the case is fully adjudicated. How likely is the judge to grant it? Nolan asked. With this evidence, Prescott said, considerably more likely than I would have said 2 days ago. He paused. There's one more thing I need to raise. The boundary claim filed by Summit Ridge Holdings, Drummond's company, has a co-claimant, a man named Gerald Moss. The room was very quiet. Moss is a named plaintiff in the court action, Prescott said, which means he has a direct legal stake in the outcome, which also means that his activities at the ranch, the document destruction, the intimidation of staff, the dispatch of riders to pursue you, can potentially be characterized as obstruction of a court proceeding rather than simply employment misconduct. Evelyn looked at Nolan. Nolan looked at the desk with the expression of a man absorbing a betrayal he'd already known about intellectually but was still in some way feeling for the first time. He was a named plaintiff the whole time, Nolan said, while he was managing my ranch. Yes, Prescott said. He stood in my office and told me the land dispute was a nuisance claim with procedural problems. Yes. Nolan was quiet for a moment. When did you find out? The filing came across my desk 3 months ago. Prescott said, I wired you. Moss handles incoming correspondence, Nolan said flatly. Prescott looked pained. I see. I never received the wire, Nolan said. He intercepted it. He sat very still. The anger was there. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the controlled stillness of a man who'd learned not to let feeling run ahead of thinking. But it was the contained kind, the kind that would be useful rather than destructive. All right, he said. What do we do first? First, Prescott said, I send a wire to the federal marshal's office, because what you've described, riders pursuing you across mountain passes, deliberate destruction of evidence, interception of legal correspondence, that goes beyond a property dispute. That's criminal interference. He was already reaching for paper. Then I draft the injunction application, and then we prepare your testimony. He looked at Evelyn. Yours as well. The court will want the bookkeeper who uncovered this on record. I'll be there, she said. The injunction hearing was set for 3 days later. Those 3 days in Helena were the strangest Evelyn had spent in recent memory. Not because they were idle, which they weren't, but because they had the particular quality of a held breath, of waiting for a thing to either happen or not happen while doing everything possible to make it happen. She and Prescott worked through the evidence together, him asking questions and her answering them in the precise, documented way she'd learned to speak about financial records, building the structure of the presentation one verified fact at a time. She stayed at a boarding house 2 streets from Prescott's office. Nolan stayed at a hotel he knew from previous business in the capital. They met at Prescott's office every morning and sometimes in the evening, and the nature of those meetings changed in a way that she noticed but didn't examine too carefully. They were more direct, less formal, the professional distance having been replaced by something that wasn't quite personal either, something that existed in the space between those things that she didn't have a clean word for. On the second evening, after Prescott had dismissed them both and the other witnesses had gone back to their respective accommodations, she and Nolan walked back toward the boarding house by a route that took longer than necessary. You're quiet, she said. I'm often quiet, he said. You're quiet differently than usual. He looked at the street ahead. I keep thinking about the ranch, he said, about what Moss did to it while I was working beside him. I trusted him with the people there, with their wages, their contracts, their housing. He stole from them and used my trust to do it. A pause. I'm responsible for that. not legally, but responsible. You didn't steal from them, she said. No, he said, but I didn't protect them from someone who did, and I had the resources and the authority to protect them, and I didn't use those resources carefully enough. He looked at her. You'd have seen it sooner. I was looking specifically for it, she said, because I'd seen it before. That's not the same as being smarter or more careful. It's the same as having a map of a place you've already been. Maybe, he said. He was quiet for half a block. When this is finished, when the court has done what it's going to do, I want to change how the ranch operates. Transparent accounting, open records, quarterly accounting reviews by someone independent of the administrative structure. He glanced at her. I'd like to talk to you about what that should look like. I'll be here for the hearing, she said carefully. After that, wherever you're going, he said, I'd like to write to you about it, if that's acceptable. She thought about the word acceptable and the careful way he'd used it and what it meant coming from a man who chose his words the way he chose everything, deliberately, without waste. That's acceptable, she said. He nodded once, satisfied in the way that someone is satisfied when a thing they needed to say has been said correctly. They walked the rest of the way in comfortable silence, which was its own kind of answer. The injunction hearing was at 10 in the morning in a courtroom that smelled of pine resin and old paper, with a judge named Calvert, who was somewhere past 60 and had the face of a man who'd heard most of what people were capable of and was no longer surprised by any of it. Prescott presented the evidence in the order Evelyn had helped him structure. Property transfers first, establishing the scheme's architecture, then the shell company identifications showing the network, then Drummond's connection, documented through the registration chain. Then the water rights fraud, with Nolan's testimony about the July signing. Then the wage theft, corroborated by Tanner and Reese. She watched the judge's face throughout. He was a hard read, the professional blankness of a man who'd learned not to let his reactions influence the room. But there were moments. When Prescott laid out the registration chain connecting all 4 shell companies to Drummond through the same rotating filing agents, the judge's eyes moved across the documents with a focus that wasn't performative. When Tanner testified about 6 years of shorted wages and produced his handwritten accounting from the ride down, the judge looked at it for longer than strictly necessary. Drummond's attorneys were good. She'd expected them to be. They were 2 men from Helena's most established firm, and they argued with the precise confidence of people accustomed to having the better resources. They challenged the documentary evidence on procedural grounds: chain of custody, authentication, the absence of the original supplier contracts that Moss had taken. They suggested that the inconsistencies Evelyn had identified were the product of a disorganized accounting system rather than deliberate fraud. They raised Nolan's signature on the water rights document and described it as voluntary. It was the chain of custody argument that worried her most because it was the strongest. The barn files had been stored in non-standard locations. She'd moved documents from their original positions. Some of the copies she'd made were not certified. Any single piece, examined in isolation from the pattern, could be questioned. She'd been prepared for this. Prescott had prepared for it too. When opposing counsel finished, Prescott stood and said, "Your Honor, the defense has correctly noted that individual documents taken in isolation could be subject to alternative interpretation. We would ask the court's permission to present the complete documentary chain as an integrated whole rather than as individual exhibits, and to allow the preparer of that chain to explain the organizational logic connecting each element." The judge looked at Evelyn, who was seated at the witness table. "You're the bookkeeper who compiled this evidence?" "Yes, Your Honor," she said. "You're prepared to walk the court through the complete chain?" "Yes," she said. He considered for a moment. "Proceed." She stood and took the stack of documents Prescott passed to her and began. She'd done this in her head dozens of times, on the ride down, in Prescott's office, lying awake in the boarding house. She knew the order, the connections, the specific page numbers that mattered. She spoke without notes because she'd learned that speaking without notes made people listen differently, made the information feel known rather than read, and she spoke in the plain language of someone explaining a mechanism rather than arguing a position. She showed how the property transfer chain worked. Each shell company, each filing agent, each registration, each step leading to the next with the internal logic of a system that had been carefully designed. She showed how the wage theft used the same accounting obfuscations as the property transfers, establishing a consistent methodology that indicated a single directing intelligence. She showed how the water rights acquisition fit into the larger picture, not as a separate fraud, but as a necessary component of the railway corridor strategy, only comprehensible when seen alongside the property transfers. And then she showed the letters from Margaret Fowler, the Callahans, and Ezra Webb. She had not told Prescott about these until the night before the hearing, and his expression when she produced them had been the expression of a man reassessing his estimate of someone's preparation. The 3 neighboring ranchers had replied to her letters, rapid replies, forwarded through Prescott's office, because she'd written to them with Prescott's address as the return, describing their experiences in specific enough detail to corroborate the pattern. Not enough to constitute independent legal claims, not yet, but enough to demonstrate to a judge that what Blackstone Summit had experienced was not an isolated incident, but a regional operation. These are witness letters, she said, holding them up, from 3 neighboring ranch families whose properties abut Blackstone Summit to the south and east, all of whom experienced boundary disputes resolved through identical paperwork structures in the past 2 years, all of whom dealt with the same shell company entities appearing in the Blackstone Summit transfers. Opposing counsel was on his feet. Objection, Your Honor. Those letters are not sworn testimony. They are not offered as sworn testimony, Prescott said smoothly. They are offered as corroborating pattern evidence, consistent with the documentary record already before the court. The weight the court assigns them is entirely at the court's discretion. Judge Calvert looked at the letters for a moment. I'll take them under advisement, he said, which was not a rejection. Evelyn sat down. Her hands were steady. She was very tired. The injunction was granted 2 hours later. Not the full hearing. That was still weeks away. But the emergency injunction, a freeze on all property transfers involving the named shell companies and their affiliates pending full adjudication. The practical effect was immediate and significant. Every parcel that had been moved through the fraudulent transfer chain was locked in place. No further transfers could occur. The railway corridor acquisition, which had been moving toward completion, stopped entirely. She heard the news sitting in the hallway outside the courtroom where Prescott had left her while he dealt with the paperwork. Nolan came out of the courtroom and walked down the hall to where she was sitting and stood in front of her, and she could read the result in his face before he said anything. Injunction granted, he said. I know, she said. I could hear Drummond's attorneys. He sat down beside her on the hallway bench. They sat there for a moment, both of them looking at the opposite wall with the particular blankness of people who've been running very hard and have just, for the first time, stopped. What are they going to do? She asked. Drummond's attorneys. Appeal the injunction, delay the full hearing, argue every piece of evidence individually. His voice was even but tired. It'll be months. Yes, she said, but the injunction is in place. The transfers are frozen. The railway corridor isn't going anywhere. She paused. And your attorney told me before the hearing that the federal marshal's office has opened an inquiry into the obstruction issues, the riders, the document destruction. Once that inquiry produces findings, it will intersect with the civil case. He was quiet for a moment. Moss is still at the ranch. Not for long, she said. Once the marshal's inquiry reaches him. I know, he said. I meant... He stopped. Then, I rode home to that ranch every evening for 4 years believing the man managing it was honest. I had dinner with him at that table. I trusted him with the wages of people who'd worked for me for years. He looked at the floor. That's not easy to... He stopped again. No, she said. It's not. She didn't offer anything else, because there wasn't anything else that would help. Some things didn't have remedies beyond acknowledgement, and she learned that offering false comfort to someone who was too direct to accept it was its own kind of disrespect. After a minute, Nolan said, I owe you a significant debt for what you've done here. You hired me to do accounting, she said. I did thorough accounting. Evelyn. She looked at him. He almost never used her first name. She registered that. I know what this cost you, he said, coming here, working in those records, going through it all again, the same mechanisms that took your family's ranch. You didn't have to engage with it as deeply as you did. You could have done the minimum the job required and left. She thought about that. About the morning she'd found the first inconsistency in the payroll ledger and the feeling she'd recognized. Not quite anger, something underneath anger, the cold and focused thing that had kept her working through 2 attorneys' records for a year after they lost the Harper place. I didn't do it for your ranch, she said. I did it because this is what I know how to do, and because someone has to. Yes, he said, but it matters that you're the one who did. The hallway was quiet. Somewhere in the building, a door opened and closed, footsteps moving away down a corridor. Outside the tall windows, the afternoon light was coming in at the flat angle of October, long and pale across the floorboards. "The full hearing," she said. "Your attorney will need someone to maintain the evidentiary record as the case develops, to organize any additional documentation that emerges from the marshal's inquiry, to keep the financial analysis current as opposing counsel challenges it." "I'll need that person to be in Helena," he said. "I can work from Helena," she said. "Or," he said carefully, in the tone of someone who has been thinking about a thing for longer than the immediate moment, "the accounting work could be done from the ranch directly, where the records actually are." She looked at him. "There is a position available," he said. "The current bookkeeper appears to have left somewhat abruptly." She thought about the office with the cracked spine ledgers and the shelves she'd organized, and the desk where she'd worked by lamplight until midnight, and the window through which she'd watched the yard for strangers. She thought about Braddock and Curtis and Tanner and Reese. She thought about the East Wing and the oak table and the coffee that was stronger than anything else she'd found in 3 counties. "The accounting system needs to be rebuilt from the ground up," she said. "Properly this time. Transparent ledgers, quarterly independent review, documented protocols for every financial transaction." "Agreed," he said. "And I'll need unrestricted access to every record, not just what the foreman decides I should see." "There won't be a foreman in the same capacity," he said. "The administrative structure is changing, and the wage arrears for Tanner and Reese need to be paid immediately, before anything else." "Already discussed with Prescott," he said. "He'll arrange the payment from the operating accounts this week." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back at her with those steady gray eyes that had been one of the first things she'd noticed about him. The quality of actually being present when he looked at someone, of not performing attention while thinking about something else. "All right," she said. "I'll stay." Something in his expression shifted. Not dramatic, not the broad relief of someone who'd been anxious, because he didn't do things broadly. A quieter shift, the kind that happened when something a person had been carefully not wanting too much was given to them anyway. "Good," he said. "Just that. Good." Prescott appeared at the end of the hallway with a sheaf of papers and the efficient manner of a man with things that required signing. Nolan stood and straightened his coat and became again the person who dealt with what was in front of him, and Evelyn stood too and gathered herself in the same way. But as they walked toward Prescott, Nolan's hand brushed hers. Not quite accidentally, not quite deliberately, in the ambiguous territory of something that hadn't decided what it was yet. And neither of them said anything about it or moved away. The hallway was long, and the afternoon light came through the windows in long, quiet bars, and outside the territorial capital went on being itself, indifferent and busy, while inside the courthouse 2 people walked toward the paperwork that would begin to undo 6 years of careful, patient theft, and neither of them thought about what came next because what was right in front of them was already more than enough. 3 days later, federal marshals arrived at Blackstone Summit Ranch. Gerald Moss was not there when they came. Someone had warned him, and he'd left quickly, though not quietly enough, because he'd taken documents that turned out to be exactly the documents the marshal's office had wanted to examine, and the taking of them became its own evidentiary trail. He was found in Butte 8 days later at a hotel registered under a name that wasn't his, with a saddlebag full of papers that he'd apparently believed he was destroying the case with and was actually completing it. Calder Drummond was arrested in Helena the same week. He did not go quietly. He had attorneys in the room before the marshals had finished reading the charges, and those attorneys were good, and they would fight everything for as long as the law allowed fighting. But the injunction was in place, and the documents were in the court record, and the 3 ranch hands had given sworn statements, and Evelyn Harper had built a chain of evidence that held together at every joint. She heard about Drummond's arrest from Prescott's clerk, who came to the boarding house with a note. She read it standing in the doorway, then folded it and put it in her coat pocket. She went inside and sat at the small desk the boarding house provided and took out her pen and a piece of paper and wrote to Margaret Fowler first, then to the Callahans, then to Ezra Webb. She told each of them what had happened, what the injunction meant, what the next steps in the proceeding would likely be, and what they should ask their own attorneys, if they had them, and if they didn't, where to find one, about filing supplemental claims on their own behalf. She wrote 3 letters in an hour, sealed them, and put them in the boarding house's outgoing post. Then she went back to Prescott's office because there was still more work to do, and she was the one who knew how to do it. And that was enough of a reason, and had always been enough of a reason, and she was increasingly certain that it always would be. The full hearing took 11 weeks. That was not unusual, Prescott told her. Property fraud cases of this complexity routinely ran longer. Drummond's attorneys were skilled, and they were thorough, and they had resources enough to contest every exhibit, challenge every witness, file every available procedural motion. They were doing their jobs, which was to make the process as expensive and exhausting as possible, in the hope that the other side would eventually run out of either money or endurance. Drummond had miscalculated on both counts. Nolan Blackstone had the resources to sustain a prolonged legal battle, which Drummond had apparently not adequately accounted for in his original assessment of the target, and Evelyn Harper did not run out of endurance. That was not a thing she did. She worked out of Prescott's office for the first 3 weeks in Helena, organizing the supplemental evidence as the marshal's inquiry produced it. And it produced considerably more than she'd anticipated. When the marshals searched Moss's hotel room in Butte, they found not only the documents he'd taken from the ranch, but a second set of records she hadn't known existed. A parallel ledger system Moss had maintained privately, tracking every fraudulent transaction in precise detail, ostensibly so he could keep his own accounting straight, separate from the official books. It was, Prescott told her with the dry appreciation of a lawyer who'd seen most things, the most thorough piece of self-incriminating documentation he'd encountered in 20 years of practice. He kept his own records, she said when Prescott showed her the copies. Apparently, he didn't trust Drummond's accounting, Prescott said. Smart enough to document everything, she said, not smart enough to destroy it before he ran. She looked through the parallel ledger with the focused attention she brought to all financial records, and within an hour she'd found 3 additional fraudulent transfers she hadn't identified from the ranch documents alone. 2 involving neighboring properties she hadn't yet connected to the scheme. 1 involving a water rights claim in a different county entirely. This is bigger than we thought, she said. Yes, Prescott said. The marshal's office is now looking at properties in 4 counties. She looked up from the ledger. The Harper Ranch, she said carefully. My family's ranch. It's in Gallatin County. Prescott met her eyes. I know, he said. I've already sent the relevant portions of Moss's ledger to the marshal's contact in Bozeman. She sat with that for a moment. The Harper Ranch was sold. It had been sold 2 years ago to a legitimate buyer who'd purchased it in good faith from the fraudulent transferee, which created a chain of title problem that was genuinely complicated and might never be fully resolved. But if the original fraudulent transfer could be proven, if Consolidated Western Properties' involvement in the Harper case could be established through Moss's own records, then at minimum her family was owed restitution for the difference between what they'd received and what the property had actually been worth. It wasn't the ranch back. It was never going to be the ranch back. But it was something. It was the difference between a wrong that had happened and a wrong that had been acknowledged. And she'd learned in the past 2 years that the acknowledgement mattered more than she'd expected it to. Thank you, she said to Prescott. It came out quieter than she intended. He nodded once, efficiently, and went back to his papers. He was not a sentimental man, which she respected, and he had work to do, which she understood. She picked up her pen and went back to the parallel ledger. She returned to Blackstone Summit in late November. Nolan had gone back 3 weeks earlier. The ranch needed management that wasn't Moss, and Nolan was the only one who could provide it, and they both understood that the legal case was in Prescott's hands now, and her presence in Helena was no longer the critical variable it had been. They'd said goodbye at Prescott's office door on a gray Tuesday morning, and it had been a practical goodbye, logistical, focused on the remaining evidentiary tasks and the communication protocols she'd established with Prescott's clerk, except that before he left, he'd said, "Come back when you're ready," and the way he'd said it, not as an employment instruction, but as something else, something that lived in the space between professional and personal where they'd been operating for months, had stayed with her through 3 more weeks of Helena hotel rooms and courthouse hallways and late-night work at Prescott's desk. She rode back up the mountain trail on a horse Prescott's office had arranged, and the pines closed in on both sides the same way they had in October, and the sky above them was the flat white of a sky that would produce snow before evening. She smelled the ranch before she saw it, same as before. Wood smoke and horses and the mineral cold of elevation. But when the trees opened up and the ranch came into view, something was different. It took her a moment to identify what it was. The buildings were the same, the yard was the same, the barn was where it had always been. But there was a quality of activity in the yard. 3 or 4 ranch hands moving with the particular purposefulness of people doing work they'd chosen rather than work they'd been assigned. And the main house had a lamp in every window, even in the afternoon, and someone had repaired the paddock fence she'd noticed was broken the first week she'd arrived. Tanner was crossing the yard when she rode in. He saw her, stopped, and gave the short nod of a man who'd expected something and was satisfied to see it occur. "Miss Harper," he said, "we've been getting the accounting room ready." "The accounting room," she said. "Nolan had us clear out the storage room next to the office," he said. "Put a bigger desk in it. better shelves. He said this in the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting a task that had been completed, not asking for a response. She handed him her horse. "Where is he?" "North pasture," Tanner said. "Where else?" She found him at the fence line that marked the boundary of the north pasture, the section that held the railway corridor. He was replacing a fence post. She could see the post hole digger leaned against the wire, the fresh-turned earth at his feet, the way he was setting the post with the practiced patience of someone who'd done this particular task several hundred times. He heard her coming across the frozen grass and looked up but didn't stop working until the post was set, which she found consistent with everything she knew about him. "You're back," he said. "I'm back," she said. He looked at her for a moment, then at the fence line, then back at her. "How'd it go? The last weeks?" "Moss's parallel ledger changes the scope significantly," she said. "The marshal's inquiry now covers 4 counties. There will be additional claimants in the main proceeding. Neighboring families who were victimized by the same scheme." She paused. "Including possibly my family's former ranch in Gallatin County." He was quiet. "Possibly?" "The title chain is complicated. The property sold to a good faith buyer, but the original fraudulent transfer is documented in Moss's records." She kept her voice even. "Prescott says there's a reasonable case for restitution of the difference in value." "That's not nothing," Nolan said. "No," she said. "It's not nothing." He set the post hole digger against the wire and looked at the pasture, the long, frost-pale grass running to the tree line, the mountains beyond, the corridor of land that had been the center of everything. "Drummond wanted this because of what it was worth," he said. "My father bought it because it was good land. He didn't know about the railway survey. He just knew it was good land and he wanted to work it." A pause. "I think about that sometimes. How the same piece of ground can mean completely different things to different people." She stood beside him and looked at the same view. The sky was doing what she'd expected, dropping lower, the white thickening to the particular density that preceded snow. "Your father built something that lasted," she said. "Drummond built something that didn't. The land is still here." "So far," he said, but he said it differently than he might have said it 2 months ago. Not with the tension of someone managing anxiety, but with the simple acknowledgement of a man who understood that nothing was guaranteed and had made his peace with that. They stood there for a moment in the cold and the approaching weather, and she thought about what it meant to be standing at a fence line on property that had been fought for and nearly lost and recovered through months of work that she had been part of. She thought about her father, who had been a careful man who'd done everything right and still lost what he'd built. She thought about the difference between her father's situation and Nolan's, and decided the difference was partly luck and partly timing and partly the particular accident of her arriving with the specific knowledge she'd carried. She didn't know how to feel about that exactly. Grateful seemed both accurate and insufficient. "Tanner told me you had a room set up," she said. "The storage room was wasted space," he said. "You need a proper office if you're going to rebuild the accounting system." "I'm going to need more than a proper office," she said. "I'm going to need full access to every financial record going back 10 years, and I'm going to need your cooperation when I tell you that something in the current operations needs to change, which will happen regularly." "I know," he said, "and I'm going to need you to stop signing documents you haven't read." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "I know that too." "All right," she said. "Then let's go inside. It's going to snow in about 20 minutes. He picked up the post hole digger and they walked back across the frozen north pasture toward the ranch buildings, and the first snow began to fall before they reached the yard. Not 20 minutes, more like 10, because Montana weather didn't consult anyone's estimates. And by the time they came through the gate, the flakes were coming down in the steady, unhurried way of a snow that intended to last. The formal judgment came down in February. Prescott sent a wire, which she received in the ranch office on a Tuesday morning, sitting at the new desk in the cleared-out room that had become the accounting office. She read it twice, then went to find Nolan. He was at the barn. She handed him the wire without saying anything, because the wire said it clearly enough. He read it. His face was still in the particular way it went still when he was absorbing something large. Then he read it again. The court had ruled in full on the primary claims. Every fraudulent property transfer originating with the shell companies was voided. Not just frozen, voided as legally null as if they'd never occurred. Every parcel returned to its rightful owner of record. The water rights transfer was annulled on the grounds of misrepresentation, the consideration of $40 having never been paid and the document having been signed under false pretenses. The railway corridor remained part of Blackstone Summit Ranch as it had always legally been, and the claim filed by Summit Ridge Holdings was dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could not be refiled. Gerald Moss had entered a guilty plea to charges of fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and criminal conspiracy, and had been sentenced to 7 years in territorial prison. His plea had included a full cooperation agreement with the Marshal's inquiry into the broader network, which had accelerated the investigation into the 4-county scheme significantly. Calder Drummond had not entered a plea. His case was proceeding to criminal trial on charges that included fraud, conspiracy, and criminal interference with court proceedings. His attorneys were still fighting. They would keep fighting for some time. But the civil judgment against his companies was already in place, and the court had ordered the disgorgement of all profits derived from the fraudulent scheme, a figure that Prescott's Wire described as substantial and that Evelyn had estimated in her own accounting work at somewhere north of $400,000 to be distributed among the victims of the scheme across 4 counties: Margaret Fowler, the Callahans, Ezra Webb, 11 other families she'd identified through the proceeding, and, pending the Gallatin County review, possibly what remained of the Harper family's claim. Nolan folded the wire. He looked at the barn wall for a moment, then he said, "It held." "Yes," she said. "The evidence held, all of it." "Every piece," she said. "I told you it would." He looked at her. "You told me we had enough," he said. "You weren't certain." "I was certain enough," she said. "There's a difference." Something in his face that she'd seen before, that almost there expression, the one that wasn't quite a smile but was in the same county, came and went. "My father would have liked you," he said. "Not for the first time. But this time differently, with more weight behind it, the way you say a thing when you've been thinking about it for longer than the moment." "You've said that before," she said. "It's still true," he said. They stood in the barn doorway with the February cold coming in from the yard, and the wire folded in his hand, and 11 weeks of courtroom and mountain passes and lamplight work and 2-hour sleep shifts and a hallway in the Helena courthouse and a covered walkway in an October night between them, all of it compressed into the ordinary moment of standing in a barn door in the winter. "Curtis is going to want to hear this," she said. "Tanner first," he said. "He's been asking every morning." "Tanner first," she agreed. They went to find Tanner. The wage payments went out that same week. Prescott had arranged it from the operating accounts as promised, but the distribution itself, the actual handing of money to the men who were owed it, Nolan handled personally. Not through an agent, not through a clerk. He sat at the table in the bunkhouse with the accounting ledger Evelyn had prepared, which listed every man's name, every month of shorted wages, and the exact amount owed with interest calculated at the standard territorial rate, and he paid each man in turn with a handshake and a direct acknowledgement of what had been taken and how long it had gone unaddressed. She sat in the corner of the bunkhouse during this and watched. She had not been asked to be there and had not announced she was coming. She had simply appeared with the ledger, which was her legitimate reason, and stayed because she wanted to see it. Tanner was the last one called. He came to the table with the same weathered patience he brought to everything, took the envelope Nolan slid across the table and didn't open it or count it. He just put it in his inside vest pocket, the same place he'd put the letters for Harmon. "We're square," he said to Nolan. "We're square," Nolan agreed, "and I'm sorry it took this long." Tanner looked at him for a moment. "You didn't know," he said. "If you'd known, it wouldn't have happened. Everybody here understands that." He glanced at Evelyn in the corner. "We also understand who figured it out." He put his hat on. "I'm going to go look at the north pasture fence. Some of those posts are going soft." He left. The other hands filed out after him. Curtis was last, and he stopped near Evelyn on his way to the door. "My wages were all right," he said. "Moss didn't short me, I think because he wanted me cooperative." He paused. "I wasn't really, but I wasn't brave enough either." "You were brave when it counted," she said. "The Alderman Creek draw, the ride to Harmon." "That wasn't bravery," he said. "That was just doing what was right when someone told me clearly enough what right was." He thought about that. Maybe that's what bravery is most of the time. Just doing the obvious thing once someone makes the obvious thing visible. She thought that was probably true. She thought about her own father, who'd been a careful man, and about how the obvious thing hadn't been visible to him until too late, and about how that wasn't his failure so much as the particular genius of a scheme designed specifically to prevent the obvious thing from being visible. The Drummond operation had worked because it was designed to be invisible. The only reason she'd seen it was because she'd already walked through a version of it and knew the shape from the inside. You couldn't ask someone to recognize a thing they'd never encountered. What you could do, what she'd done, what Prescott was now doing in 4 counties, was make the shape of it visible enough that the next person could recognize it sooner. That was something. That was more than nothing. Spring came to Blackstone Summit in the particular lurching way of Montana springs, cold one week and warm the next. The snow retreating up the mountain faces in slow, irregular patches while the valley floor turned from brown to the tentative green of new grass. The ranch moved into the seasonal rhythms that Evelyn had not been there long enough to see the previous year. The calving work, the fence repairs expanding to the full property line, the procurement of summer supplies through the renegotiated contracts she'd spent 2 months rebuilding from scratch through legitimate suppliers, including Hollis Greer's trading post in Red Pine, which now held the ranch's primary winter supply contract and whose owner had sent a characteristically terse note upon receiving the paperwork. Satisfied. H. Greer. The accounting system she'd built bore no resemblance to what she'd found in October. Every transaction documented, every account traceable, every payroll entry reconcilable to the individual. Quarterly reviews were scheduled with an independent auditor in Billings, a condition she'd made non-negotiable and Nolan had agreed to without argument, which she'd taken as evidence that he'd genuinely absorbed the lesson of Moss's years rather than just tolerating the oversight. She'd also built a cross-reference system linking the Blackstone Summit records to the public filings for the 4 neighboring families whose properties had been targeted, not their private records, which weren't her business, but the public documents, so that she could monitor for any future activity by successor entities to Drummond's shell companies. Drummond's criminal trial was still ongoing. His attorneys were still fighting. But the network itself had been dismantled, its financial assets seized, its shell companies dissolved by court order. Whatever came next for Calder Drummond personally, the mechanism he'd built was gone. She told Nolan this on a late April evening when they were both in the accounting office, him reviewing a procurement proposal she'd drafted, her updating the spring payroll. She'd come to understand that he was the kind of person who needed to understand things fully rather than receive summaries, so she'd learned to explain her work rather than just deliver conclusions, which was a different discipline than she'd practiced before, but one that she found she didn't mind. The successor entity monitoring, he said, looking up from the procurement proposal. How long does that need to run? 5 years minimum, she said. Maybe 10. These operations don't always die completely. Sometimes the people involved reconstitute under new structures. He looked at her steadily. You're planning to be here in 10 years, he said. It was half a question. I am planning to have a system that runs correctly in 10 years regardless of who's managing it, she said carefully. Good accounting systems outlast the people who build them. That's the point. That's not what I asked, he said. She put down her pen. Outside the window, the April evening was doing something complicated with the light, turning the valley a color that was almost gold without quite achieving it. No, she said, it's not. He closed the procurement proposal and set it on the desk. He was not a man who built toward things dramatically. He'd told her that in the East Wing over coffee months ago, essentially, when he'd explained how he'd run his own ranch, working beside the people, without announcement, letting the work speak rather than the performance of work. She'd come to understand that this applied to everything about him, including the things that weren't ranch operations. I told you in October, he said, that I'd chosen you for this position because of your history, because of what you'd seen and what you knew. I remember, she said. I want to be honest about something else, he said. I've wanted to be honest about it for a while, and I haven't found the right time, which is probably because I was waiting for a right time and the right time wasn't coming on its own. She waited. She was good at waiting. The morning I first came to the office doorway, he said, when you'd been working late and I came to see if you needed anything, I told Curtis I was checking on the new bookkeeper. That was true, but it wasn't the whole reason. He looked at the desk. I'd seen you walking up the trail from the stage road with your suitcase in the October cold, and you didn't stop once. She thought about that. About the trail from the stage road, 2 miles of steep and rocky terrain with a suitcase that was not light. She hadn't stopped because stopping didn't make the trail shorter. She hadn't thought of it as anything but necessary. I thought, he said, that a person who walks like that, who doesn't stop, who doesn't look for someone to carry the bag or a shorter route, is someone worth knowing. He met her eyes. That was before I knew anything about you. Before the accounting, before the fraud, before any of it. A pause. I wanted you to know that. Because everything that came after. It matters that you know the beginning wasn't calculated. The beginning was just you walking up a hill. She sat with that for a moment. She thought about the way it was possible to be known, the different ways, the calculated assessment of what someone could do for you versus the simpler, less useful, more durable thing of someone seeing you move through the world and deciding, without information or advantage, that you were worth knowing. Her father had been seen that way by her mother, she knew. Her mother had told her once that she'd decided about her father when she watched him stop to help a stranger fix a broken wagon wheel on a road where stopping cost him time he didn't have. Not because it was impressive, because it was obvious to him. The obvious thing, visible enough to see. "Nolan," she said. "Yes." "You're going to have to ask me something directly," she said, "because I've been very patient and I'm better at patience than most people, but I'm also a woman who walked up a hill with a heavy suitcase and didn't stop. And if you make me wait any longer for the direct version of this conversation, I'm going to have some critical thoughts about your judgment." He looked at her. Something in his face did the thing it did. That almost smile, but this time it completed itself. Actually completed, actually became the smile, which changed his face entirely in a way she hadn't seen before and found she wanted to see again. "Stay," he said. "Not for the accounting, not for the proceeding, not because the system needs maintaining or the ranch needs records." He leaned slightly forward across the desk. "Stay because I'd like to spend the next considerable portion of my life talking to you. Because you're the first person I've met in a long time who says the true thing instead of the easy thing and who does the necessary thing without waiting to be asked. And because this ranch is better with you in it, and I think I am too, though I'm aware that's a harder thing to demonstrate." She looked at him across the desk with its neat stacks of ledgers and the window behind him showing the last of the April evening light going gold over the valley. She thought about what she'd believed 2 years ago in Billings, standing in an attorney's office looking at the paperwork that explained how her family's ranch had been taken. She'd believed in that office that the world was primarily a place where careful people built things and careless or dishonest people took them, and that the best a person could do was to become very good at seeing the taking before it happened. She'd organized her life around that understanding. It had served her well enough. She hadn't believed in that office that she was going to end up somewhere like this. She hadn't been thinking about somewhere like this. She'd been thinking about survival, about competence, about the clean satisfaction of a ledger that balanced. But here was the thing about ledgers. She knew this better than anyone. A ledger only told you what had been entered. It didn't tell you what was coming. The future was always the unwritten columns, the blank pages at the back of the book. She had very good handwriting. She'd been told this her whole life. She was also extremely good at starting from scratch, at building a system from disordered materials, at finding the truth in a mess of numbers that other people had given up on. The ranch was outside the window in the April light. The mountains were where they'd always been, close enough to seem like walls, distant enough to remain the horizon. Somewhere in the north pasture, Tanner was probably checking fence posts with the focused patience of a man who understood that the boundary of a thing mattered and was worth maintaining. "All right," she said. He was quiet. "All right, you'll stay." "All right, I'll stay," she said. "And all right to the rest of it, the considerable portion, the talking." She looked at him steadily. "Though I want it noted that I decided about you long before this conversation." "When?" he said. She thought about it honestly. "The first morning I saw you walking across the yard to fix fence before dawn," she said, "when you didn't know anyone was watching." He held her gaze. "That's the only time I'm worth watching," he said, "when I don't know anyone is." "I know," she said. "That's why it mattered." Get. Margaret Fowler received her restitution in June. Not the full value of what she'd lost, because the court's disgorgement distribution was divided among too many claimants for anyone to be made completely whole, but enough to repair her main barn and pay off the debt she'd been carrying since the boundary dispute had forced her to reduce her herd. She wrote to Evelyn when the payment came, a short letter in the plain handwriting of someone who wrote infrequently and chose their words accordingly. It said, "I didn't think this kind of thing got fixed. Thank you for being the kind of person who fixes it." That's all it said. Evelyn kept the letter in the accounting office desk. The Callahan family used their restitution to hire a proper attorney and file their own supplemental claim, which added a new thread to the Drummond criminal proceedings and was expected to produce further disgorgement from Drummond's remaining assets. Ezra Webb, characteristically, spent 2 months arguing with Prescott about the calculation method before accepting the payment, and then sent a case of good whiskey to the courthouse, addressed to no one in particular, which Prescott's clerk told her about with evident appreciation. The Gallatin County Review concluded in August. The original fraudulent transfer of the Harper Ranch was confirmed in Moss's records. The restitution calculation was complex. The good faith buyer's rights had to be protected, which meant the recovery came from Drummond's seized assets rather than from the property itself. And the final amount was less than the ranch had been worth at the time of the fraud. It was not nothing. Evelyn's mother, who was living with her sister in Bozeman, received the restitution payment by bank transfer in September. She wrote to Evelyn a letter that was longer than Evelyn expected, and in it she said something that Evelyn thought about for a long time afterward. Your father would have been so angry that it happened, and then he would have been so proud that you did something about it. Both of those things are true, and they don't cancel each other out. She read the letter at the accounting office desk on a September evening with the window open to the cooling air and the ranch sounds coming in. Horses, someone crossing the yard, the particular quality of mountain evening that was different from any other kind of evening she'd known. And she thought about what her mother had said. Both things true, not canceling each other out. That was the thing she'd had to learn, she thought. That loss and recovery weren't opposites. That something could be genuinely, permanently broken and also genuinely, practically healed. Not restored to original condition, because that was not how healing worked, but changed into something that could carry weight again. Different weight, sometimes more weight. Her father had been a careful man. She had inherited his carefulness and added something of her own to it. A willingness to look at the wreckage of a thing, understand exactly how it had failed, and build the next version better. She didn't know whether that was courage or just the particular stubbornness of someone who couldn't tolerate an unsolved problem. Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe those were the same thing most of the time. Nolan found her there, still at the desk with the window open and the evening coming in, and he came and stood near the window in the way he stood near things, present without demanding, there without insisting on being noticed. "Letter from your mother?" he said. He'd seen the envelope. "Yes," she said. "Good news about the Gallatin County claim." "Good," he said. He looked at the window, at the valley going dark in the September evening, the mountains holding the last light longer than the valley floor did. "You should write back to her," he said. "Tell her to come visit. The fall's a good time on the ranch." She looked at him. "You want my mother to visit?" "I want to meet her," he said. "She raised someone worth knowing. I'm interested in how that happened." She thought about her mother in the ranch yard, looking at the mountains, probably finding them excessive and not saying so. She thought about Tanner showing her mother the north pasture fence with the same patient thoroughness with which he showed everything. She thought about the bunkhouse in the evening and the harmonica player who'd gotten marginally better since October. "I'll write to her," she said. She turned back to the desk and picked up her pen. Nolan stayed at the window a moment longer, looking out at the valley, and then he moved toward the door. Going to check something, going to fix something, going to do whatever the next necessary thing was, which was how he moved through his life and how she suspected he would keep moving through it. "Nolan," she said. He stopped. "The north pasture fence," she said. "Tanner thinks the posts along the east side are going soft. You should look at them before the ground freezes." "I know," he said. "I'm going now." "The ground's going to freeze earlier than you think," she said. "It always does." "I know that too," he said, and she could hear the almost smile in his voice without needing to see his face. "Good night, Evelyn." "Good night," she said. He went out. She heard his boots on the porch, then the yard, then the sound diminishing toward the north pasture where the fence needed work and the ground would freeze earlier than expected, and the mountains held the last light longer than anything else in the valley. She turned to a fresh page in the ledger. She dated it. She wrote the first entry in her clear, precise hand. Outside, the September evening settled over Blackstone Summit Ranch, over the barn and the bunkhouse and the new accounting office and the east wing with its bookshelves and its strong coffee, over the north pasture and its fence line and the railway corridor beyond it, over 3 families to the south and east who were slowly understanding that something taken from them had been acknowledged and partially returned, over a trading post in Red Pine, where Hollis Greer was probably reordering stock with the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd waited 3 years for an account to be settled and had finally seen it settled, Over all of it, the mountains stood where they had always stood, indifferent and enormous and unchanged by everything that had happened in their shadow. And the last light on their upper faces was the color of something Evelyn didn't have a word for, but recognized as the particular gold of a place that had been worth fighting for. She kept writing. The ledger was not yet full. There were many